The doctor did not look up from the folder in his hands. That alone told Alistair everything before a single word was spoken. Men who deliver good news look you in the eye. Men who deliver the other kind study their paperwork like it might change if they stare hard enough. 6 months, the doctor finally said. Perhaps 8 if the treatment responds well. I am sorry, Your Grace. Alistair sat very still in the leather chair across the desk. Outside the window, London moved on as it always did, ignorant of the sentence just handed down inside this small room. A bus passed. A woman laughed at something on her phone. The world had no idea that the Duke of Wintersea had just been told he was dying. He did not cry, he did not shout. He simply asked, in a voice so calm it startled even himself, "What happens to the estate if I have no heir?" The doctor blinked, thrown by the question. "Your Grace, I think right now you should focus on." "What happens to the estate," Alistair repeated, "if I have no heir?" The doctor set down his pen. "I believe it would pass to your cousin, Mr. Marcus Wintersea, is it not?" Alistair's jaw tightened. Of course it was Marcus. It was always going to be Marcus, circling the family fortune like a bird waiting for something to die. Marcus, who had already tried twice to have himself named heir apparent while Alistair was still healthy. Marcus, who sent flowers to funerals before people had even finished dying, just to be first in line for the sympathy and the inheritance both. Alistair stood, buttoned his coat, and thanked the doctor with more courtesy than the moment probably deserved. Then he walked out into the London afternoon and did not feel the cold at all. He did not go home immediately. Instead, he walked. He walked past the hospital gates, past a small park where children were feeding pigeons, past a bakery that smelled of warm bread and made his stomach twist with an emotion he could not name. 6 months, perhaps 8. It was such a small number for a life that had felt, until an hour ago, endless in its dullness. Wintersea Hall had stood for 300 years. Dukes had been born there, had married there, had died in the same beds their fathers had died in. Alistair had always assumed he would follow that same tired pattern, marry someone suitable, produce an heir out of obligation, grow old and gray inside those cold stone walls. He had never imagined the ending would come first, before any of the rest of it. He thought of his father, distant and unsmiling, who had taught him that duty came before feeling. He thought of his mother, who had left when Alistair was 9 years old and never once looked back, as if the title and the house and the son that came with them had simply been too heavy to carry. He thought of Marcus, already probably measuring the drapes in his head. By the time Alistair reached his car, something inside him had hardened into decision. He would not let the house fall to Marcus. He would not let 3 centuries of his family's story end with a man who cared for nothing but money and status. If he had 6 months, he would spend them making sure Wintersea Hall passed to someone who deserved it, his own child, if such a thing could still happen in time. He needed a wife, quickly, and he needed her to understand exactly what she was agreeing to without pretending it was anything more than what it was. His driver, Oliver, glanced at him through the mirror as they pulled away from the hospital. "Everything all right, sir?" "No," Alistair said honestly, "but it will be handled." That evening, alone in his study, Alistair began making a list of names. Society women his family had once considered suitable matches, daughters of old friends. Women who understood what it meant to marry into duty rather than love. He wrote 5 names before crossing every single one out. He did not want a woman who would marry him for the title and disappear the moment the funeral was over. He did not want someone cold, calculating, already planning her mourning wardrobe. If he was going to spend his last months tied to someone, he wanted at least a small measure of peace in the arrangement, even if love was too much to ask for. And that was when he remembered her. 3 months earlier, Alistair had been hospitalized for a week with complications from the illness he did not yet have a name for. He had been irritable, exhausted, and short with everyone who came near him, nurses, doctors, even the cleaning staff. Everyone except for one young woman from the records department, who had been sent to collect his paperwork one evening when the ward was short-staffed. She had not known who he was, To her, he was simply a tired, sick man in a hospital bed, snapping at people because he was frightened and refused to admit it. Instead of leaving quickly like the others, she had sat down for a moment, told him a small joke about the terrible hospital tea, and asked if he wanted the window open or closed. It was such a small kindness. It had meant nothing to her. It had meant everything to him. Her name, he remembered now, was Elena Marsh. He had never forgotten her face, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was honest. There had been no performance in her kindness, no attempt to impress a wealthy patient she did not recognize. She had simply been decent, in a moment when decency cost her nothing and gained her nothing either. Alistair picked up his phone and called his solicitor. "I need you to find someone for me," he said. "A young woman named Elena Marsh. She works or worked in hospital records at St. Aldrich's. I need her address by morning." "May I ask why, Your Grace?" "No," Alistair said, and ended the call. He sat back in his chair, staring at the fire that had gone half cold in the grate. Somewhere in London, an ordinary woman was living an ordinary life, with no idea that a dying duke had just decided her name would change everything. Alistair did not sleep that night. He sat awake going over every possible objection Elena might raise, every reason she might say no. He was not a fool. He knew what he was asking would sound insane to any sensible person, a stranger's proposal of marriage, built entirely on necessity and a countdown clock. He knew she might slam the door in his face, might call him cruel for even suggesting such a transaction with someone's life. But he also knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that he had to try. Not simply for the estate, not simply for the title. Somewhere beneath the practical reasoning, a smaller and more honest voice admitted that he did not want to spend his final months entirely alone, surrounded only by lawyers and a cousin waiting for him to die. He wanted, if only once in his controlled and dutiful life, to be looked at the way Elena had looked at him in that hospital room, not as a duke, not as a fortune, but as a person. By morning, his solicitor had the address, a modest flat above a shop in a quiet part of the city, nothing like the grand houses Alistair had grown up in. He read it 3 times before folding the paper and placing it in his coat pocket. "Oliver brought the car around at 9. Where to, sir?" Alistair looked out the window at the grey London sky, took a slow breath, and said the words that would change the direction of whatever life he had left. "Take me to her." The drive was short, but it felt endless. Alistair had negotiated business deals worth millions without a flicker of nerves. He had stood before boards of directors and foreign dignitaries without his pulse rising once. And yet, as the car slowed outside a small brick building with peeling paint on the front door, his hands were unsteady in a way he did not recognize. He stepped out of the car. The street was ordinary, a bakery, a launderette, a woman walking a small dog who glanced at him with mild curiosity, clearly noting that expensive cars did not usually park on this road. Alistair straightened his coat, climbed the narrow steps and knocked. For a long moment nothing happened. Then the door opened and there she was. Elena Marsh looked exactly as he remembered, light brown hair pulled back loosely, tired eyes that still managed to hold warmth, a plain cardigan thrown over simple clothes. She blinked at him in confusion, clearly trying to place his face, unable to reconcile the well-dressed stranger on her doorstep with anything in her ordinary life. "Can I help you?" she asked. "You probably don't remember me," Alistair said quietly. "You brought me tea I never asked for in a hospital room 3 months ago and told me the tea was terrible before I could complain about it myself." Recognition flickered across her face slowly, then settled. "The rude patient in room 214, she said, and something like a smile tugged at her mouth despite herself. "You look different without a hospital gown." "I imagine most people do," Alistair said. There was a pause, awkward and searching. Elena studied him properly now, taking in the tailored coat, the black car idling at the curb, the quiet authority in his posture that she had somehow missed entirely in that dim hospital room. "Why are you here?" she asked, more cautious now. Alistair felt the weight of everything he needed to say pressing against his chest. This was the moment. There was no gentle way to lead into it, no version of the truth that would not sound absurd the instant it left his mouth. "My name is Alistair Thorne," he said. "I am the Duke of Wintersea, and I have come to ask you something that is going to sound completely unreasonable, and I would understand entirely if you shut this door in my face the moment I finish saying it." Elena's eyes narrowed slightly, but she did not close the door. "Go on, then." Alistair held her gaze, steadying himself the way he had steadied himself before every difficult moment in his life, and said the words that had kept him awake all night. "I have 6 months to live, and I need to find someone willing to marry me before then." For a long, silent moment, Elena simply stared at him, waiting for the joke to reveal itself. When it did not, her hand tightened slightly on the edge of the door. "You had better come in," she said finally. "Because you are either the strangest man I have ever met, or something is very wrong, and either way, I am not having this conversation on my doorstep." Alistair stepped inside, and behind him, the door closed with a quiet click that felt, somehow, like the beginning of everything. Elena's flat was small but tidy, the kind of home that belonged to someone who had learned to make do with little and never complained about it. A kettle sat on the stove. Books were stacked neatly on a shelf that did not quite fit the wall. She gestured for Alistair to sit on a worn but clean sofa, then remained standing herself, arms folded, as if putting distance between herself and whatever madness he was about to explain. "Start from the beginning," she said, "and do not leave anything out." Alistair nodded slowly, choosing his words with the same care he used when addressing his board of directors, except this time his hands would not stay still. "3 months ago, when you brought me tea in that hospital room, I did not yet know what was wrong with me. Yesterday I found out. It is a condition in my heart, one that cannot be repaired through surgery. My doctors have given me 6 months, perhaps a little longer if I am fortunate." Elena's arms slowly unfolded. Whatever suspicion she had walked in with softened, just slightly, at the plainness of his voice. There was no performance in it. He was not asking for pity. He was simply stating a fact he had clearly not yet made peace with. "I am sorry," she said quietly, "truly, but I still do not understand what that has to do with me." Alistair exhaled, steadying himself. "My family's estate, Wintersea Hall, has been passed down through direct heirs for 300 years. If I die without a child of my own, everything, the house, the land, the title, the responsibility to hundreds of tenant families who depend on that estate, passes to my cousin Marcus." "And Marcus is not a good option," Elena guessed. "Marcus," Alistair said flatly, "cares about Wintersea Hall the way a wolf cares about a lamb. He would sell what he could, mismanage what he could not, and leave nothing behind but ruin. I have spent my entire life being taught that my duty is to protect that estate and the people who depend on it. I cannot walk away from that duty simply because I am dying." Elena sat down slowly across from him, processing everything with the careful attention of someone accustomed to sorting through difficult information for a living. "So you need an heir, quickly." "I need a wife," Alistair corrected gently. "One who understands from the very beginning exactly what she is agreeing to. I am not asking for love. I am not even asking for a real marriage in the traditional sense. I am asking for a partnership, one that would give you financial security, a title, and my honest gratitude in exchange for helping me secure the future of an estate that has cared for generations of people who never asked to be abandoned to someone like Marcus." Elena was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a delivery van rumbled past, and somewhere down the hall a neighbor's radio played faintly. She studied Alistair's face, searching, it seemed, for some sign of dishonesty or cruelty hidden beneath his calm explanation. She did not find it. "Why me?" she finally asked. "You could have chosen anyone. Someone from your own world, someone who understands all of this already. Why show up on the doorstep of a hospital records clerk you spoke to for perhaps 10 minutes, months ago?" Alistair considered the question seriously before answering. "Because in 10 minutes, you showed me more genuine kindness than most people in my life have shown me in years. You did not know who I was. You had nothing to gain. And you still chose to be decent to a stranger who was being difficult and frightened and unkind in return. I have spent my whole life surrounded by people who wanted something from me. I find that I would rather spend whatever time I have left with someone who does not. Something flickered behind Alina's eyes, not quite trust, not yet, but a crack in the wall of suspicion she had built the moment he mentioned marriage. She stood, walked to the window and looked out at the gray street below, arms wrapped around herself. "You understand what you are asking," she said, not turning around. "You are asking me to marry a man I barely know, to have a child with him, and then to watch him die. You are asking me to become a widow before I have even had the chance to know what being a wife feels like." "Yes," Alistair said simply. There was no point pretending otherwise. "I am asking exactly that, and I understand if the answer is no. I have no right to ask this of anyone, least of all someone who once showed me kindness expecting nothing in return. But I did not know where else to turn, or who else I could trust to see me as something more than a title and a fortune." Alina turned back to face him. Her expression was unreadable, caught somewhere between disbelief and something gentler underneath it. "What happens to me after? If I agree, and if it works, and if you—" She could not quite finish the sentence. "If I die," Alistair finished for her, "you become Duchess of Wintersea, mother to the future Duke or Duchess, and sole guardian of an estate and fortune substantial enough that neither you nor our child would ever want for anything again. My solicitors would draw up the arrangement clearly. Nothing hidden. Nothing left to chance or to Marcus's ambitions." "And if it does not work," Alina asked quietly, "if there is no child before your time runs out?" Alistair's jaw tightened, the first crack in his composure since he had arrived. "Then Marcus inherits everything, and everything my family built for 300 years disappears into someone who never cared for it in the first place. That is the truth of it. That is why I am here, asking a woman I barely know to gamble her future on a stranger's dying request." The silence that followed stretched long and heavy. Alina moved back to her chair and sat down, elbows on her knees, staring at the floor as though the answer might be written somewhere in the worn carpet beneath her feet. "I need time," she said finally. "This is not a decision I can make standing in my living room after 10 minutes of conversation, no matter how honest you have been." "Of course," Alistair said, standing immediately, relief and disappointment tangled together in his chest. "Take whatever time you need. I will not pressure you, and I will understand completely if your answer is no." He reached into his coat and produced a card with a single number written on it. No title, no crest, nothing to suggest the weight behind the name. "This reaches me directly. Whatever you decide, I would ask only that you tell me honestly, rather than simply disappearing. I think I have had enough people disappear from my life, without explanation." Something in the way he said it, quiet, almost vulnerable, nothing like the composed Duke who had walked in 20 minutes earlier, struck Alina harder than anything else he had said. She took the card without speaking and walked him to the door. On the threshold, Alistair paused. "For what it is worth," he said, "even if your answer is no, I am glad I came to thank you properly. What you did for me that day mattered more than you likely realized." He left before she could respond, walking down the narrow steps to the waiting car, leaving Alina standing in her doorway with a small white card in her hand, and a proposal that had turned her entire ordinary Tuesday inside out. That night Alina could not sleep. She sat by her window with a cup of tea gone cold, turning the card over and over in her fingers, thinking of everything Alistair had said, and everything he had not needed to say but had said anyway. She thought about her own life, modest, steady, a little lonely if she was honest with herself, working long hours in a job that paid enough to survive but little more. She thought about her mother, gone 5 years now, who used to tell her that kindness always finds its way back around, even when you least expect it. She thought about the tired, frightened man in room 214, snapping at nurses because he was too proud to admit he was afraid, and how none of that pride or fear had been present in the man who sat across from her tonight, asking honestly for help he had no right to expect. By the time the sun began to rise over the rooftops outside her window, Alina had made her decision. Not because of the title, not because of the fortune, though she would be lying if she said the security meant nothing to a woman who had spent her whole life counting every pound carefully. She had decided because somewhere in that strange, impossible conversation, she had recognized something true. A man facing the end of his life who had chosen, above everything else, to ask rather than demand, to be honest rather than manipulate. She picked up her phone and dialed the number on the card before she could talk herself out of it. Alistair answered on the second ring, his voice careful, as though he had been waiting by the phone all night without admitting it to himself. "Alina, I have conditions," she said before he could say anything else. "If I am going to do this, it will not simply be a transaction. Whatever time you have left, we spend it honestly, as real partners, not strangers performing a contract for the sake of an estate. I will not be a placeholder in your life until you are gone. I want to actually know you, and I want you to actually know me for however long we have." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, long enough that Alina wondered if she had somehow said the wrong thing entirely. "Yes," Alistair finally said, his voice rough with an emotion he did not try to hide. "Yes. I would like that very much." Alina closed her eyes, gripping the phone a little tighter, aware that she had just changed the entire direction of her life with a single word spoken into the quiet of an early London morning. Whatever came next, she thought, at least it would not be ordinary. And after years of ordinary, that felt, strangely, like exactly what she needed. 3 days later, Alina sat across from her closest friend, Grace, in a small cafe near the hospital, trying to explain a decision that still felt unreal even as she spoke the words aloud. Grace listened with her coffee cooling untouched in front of her, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something close to alarm. "You are going to marry a duke you have met twice," Grace said slowly, "who is dying so that his cousin does not inherit a house." "That is a very simplified version," Alina said, though she could not deny it was not entirely wrong either. "Alina, people do not just marry strangers because they seem honest during one conversation. This is not a film. This is your actual life." "I know how it sounds," Alina admitted, wrapping both hands around her mug. "Believe me, I have said all of this to myself already at 3 in the morning more than once. But Grace, you did not see his face when he asked. He was not performing. He was terrified, and he still chose to ask instead of trying to force or trick someone into it. There is something rare in that, even if the whole situation is completely absurd." Grace studied her friend for a long moment, searching for the version of Alina she had known for over a decade, practical, careful, never one for impulsive decisions. "And if you fall for him, what happens then when the 6 months run out?" The question landed somewhere Alina had not let herself examine too closely yet. She looked down at her tea, the steam curling upward between them. "Then I suppose I will grieve someone I loved, the same as anyone does. At least it will have been real, however long it lasted. That feels better to me than spending my whole life wondering what I might have chosen, if I had not been too afraid to take the leap." Grace reached across the table and squeezed her hand, worry still evident in her eyes, but something like respect creeping in beside it. "Just promise me you will not lose yourself in all of this. Duke or not, dying or not, you deserve to still be you at the end of it." "I promise," Alina said and meant it. Across town, in the quiet study of Wintersea Hall, Alistair was having a considerably less gentle conversation. His solicitor, a sharp, precise man named Edmund Hale, sat across the desk with a folder of paperwork already prepared, his expression carefully neutral in the way lawyers learn to master early in their careers. "You understand," Edmund said carefully, "that marrying a woman you have known for less than a week will raise questions, particularly given the timing and particularly given what is at stake for the estate. Marcus will not simply accept this quietly." "Marcus has never accepted anything quietly in his life," Alistair said. "I am not concerned with what he thinks. I am concerned with making certain Alina is protected, regardless of what happens to me, and regardless of what challenges Marcus attempts to bring. Edmund nodded, making a note. I would recommend a prenuptial agreement that clearly protects her interests independent of any child. If, for whatever reason, there is no heir before your passing, I want to ensure she is not left with nothing after everything she will have sacrificed. Alistair considered this for a moment, then nodded firmly. Draft it generously. Whatever happens with the estate, whatever happens with an heir, Alina does not walk away from this with nothing. She did not ask for any of this. The very least I can do is make certain she is protected from all of it, including Marcus. Edmund studied his employer for a long moment, something almost gentle crossing his usually businesslike expression. You care for her already, he observed quietly. This is not merely strategy to you. Alistair did not answer right away. He looked instead toward the window, where the gardens of Wintersea Hall stretched gray and quiet under the low autumn sky, waiting, as they always had, for a family to fill them with more than silence. I have known her 1 week, he said finally, and already I find myself thinking of her more than I have thought of anything in years. Perhaps that is simply the desperation of a dying man reaching for anything that feels like warmth. Or perhaps, Edmund, some things do not require years to become real. I suppose I will find out one way or another before my time runs out. Edmund closed the folder gently. Then let us make certain, Your Grace, that whatever time you have left is spent as well as possible. I will have the papers ready within the week. Alistair nodded his thanks, and after Edmund left, he remained alone in the study for a long while, staring at the fire, thinking of a small flat above a bakery, and a woman with tired eyes and an honest heart who had somehow, in the space of a single conversation, given him something he had not expected to feel again. Hope. The wedding took place on a gray Thursday morning in the small stone chapel on the grounds of Wintersea Hall, with barely 20 people in attendance. There were no crowds, no photographers, none of the fanfare that usually surrounded the marriage of a duke. Alistair had insisted on that much, at least, that whatever else this arrangement was, it would not become a spectacle for strangers to gawk at. Alina stood at the entrance of the chapel in a simple pale dress, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped a small bouquet of white flowers Grace had helped her choose the day before. Grace stood beside her now, serving as the only witness Alina had brought, since her mother had passed years ago, and her father had never been part of her life to begin with. You do not have to do this, Grace whispered one final time, squeezing her hand. Even now, even standing here, you can still walk away. Alina looked down the aisle at Alistair, standing tall and composed beside the altar, dressed in a dark suit that could not quite disguise the slight thinness illness had already begun carving into his frame. His eyes met hers, and for a moment all the fear and uncertainty in her chest quieted into something steadier. I know, she whispered back, but I want to. The ceremony itself was brief, almost businesslike in its simplicity, though the vicar's voice carried genuine warmth as he spoke the traditional words. Alistair's hands were steady as he placed the ring on Alina's finger, though his voice caught, just slightly, when he repeated the vow to honor her in sickness and in health, a promise that, for him, carried a weight neither of them could ignore. Watching from the second row, arms crossed and expression carefully neutral, sat Marcus Wintersea. He was a tall man, handsome in a sharp, calculated way, with the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. He had arrived uninvited, claiming family loyalty demanded his presence, though everyone in the chapel understood his true purpose was simply to observe, to measure, to begin calculating what this sudden marriage might mean for his own ambitions. When the vicar finally pronounced them husband and wife, Marcus was the first to applaud, though the sound felt hollow in the quiet chapel, more performance than celebration. Congratulations, cousin, Marcus said afterward, approaching Alistair with a smile as sharp as a blade disguised as courtesy. Quite the whirlwind romance. One might almost call it suspicious, marrying so quickly given your circumstances. One might, Alistair said evenly, if one did not understand the meaning of urgency. I would think you, of all people, would appreciate efficiency, Marcus. Marcus's smile flickered just slightly before he turned his attention to Alina, studying her the way a man studies an opponent he has not yet decided how to defeat. And you, Mrs. Thorne, forgive me, Duchess. How does it feel, marrying a man you barely know, inheriting a fortune you did not earn? Alina held his gaze steadily, refusing to let his condescension unsettle her. It feels, she said calmly, like none of your business, Marcus. But since you asked, it feels like choosing to spend whatever time is given to us honestly, rather than circling someone's misfortune waiting for an opportunity. Perhaps you should try it sometime. Something flashed behind Marcus's eyes, surprise, and beneath it, a flicker of genuine dislike. He had clearly expected someone easier to intimidate. He offered a thin smile instead, inclined his head, and excused himself to find a drink, already plotting, though neither Alistair nor Alina could yet see the shape of what he was planning. The small reception that followed was quiet, held in the great hall of Wintersea Hall, where portraits of Alistair's ancestors watched from gilded frames along the walls, generations of dukes and duchesses who had stood in this same room at the beginning of their own marriages, most of them arranged for duty rather than love, much like this one had begun. Alina found herself drawn to those portraits throughout the evening, studying the painted faces of people who had lived and died within these walls long before she had ever been born. Alistair found her standing before one particular portrait, a young woman in an old-fashioned gown, her expression unreadable, painted sometime in the previous century. "That is my great-great-grandmother," Alistair said, coming to stand beside her. "Lady Cordelia. Family history says she married my great-great-grandfather for much the same reasons you married me, duty, necessity, an estate that needed protecting. They say she grew to love him deeply, eventually. Though I suppose that is the version families prefer to tell, whether or not it is entirely true." "Do you believe it?" Alina asked, studying the painted woman's careful, composed expression. Alistair considered the question seriously. "I did not, until recently. Arranged marriages built on necessity did not seem to me the kind of foundation love could grow from, but I find myself reconsidering that assumption more with each passing day." Alina turned to look at him, something warm and uncertain stirring in her chest at the honesty in his voice. "That is a very large admission, for a man who has known me only a handful of days." "I have always been direct," Alistair said simply. It seemed foolish to change that habit now, given how limited my remaining time might be. The reception continued into the evening, small and quiet, though Alina noticed Alistair growing tired earlier than the other guests, his posture straightening with visible effort, a slight tremor in his hand as he lifted his glass. She excused them both earlier than expected, guiding him gently toward the private wing of the house, ignoring Marcus's watchful gaze following them across the hall. Once alone in the quiet of the corridor, away from the noise and performance of the reception, Alistair exhaled slowly, some of the careful composure slipping from his shoulders. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for understanding, without me needing to explain." "You do not have to perform strength for me," Alina said gently. "Not here. Not ever if you do not want to. I did not marry a duke, Alistair. I married a man who is tired and frightened and trying his best, same as anyone facing something this difficult would be." Something shifted in Alistair's expression, surprise, perhaps, or relief, or both together. In 3 months of illness, surrounded by doctors and solicitors, and a household staff trained to treat him with careful deference, no one had spoken to him so plainly, so gently, without either pity or performance layered beneath their words. "I am glad it was you," he said quietly. "Whatever else happens, I am glad I found you again." They stood together in the quiet corridor for a long moment, the sounds of the reception fading behind them, two strangers who had become husband and wife in the space of a single strange week, beginning to understand that whatever this arrangement had started as, it was already becoming something neither of them had expected. The following morning, Alina woke in an unfamiliar bedroom within Wintersea Hall, sunlight filtering through heavy curtains onto furniture older than her entire family line. For a moment, disoriented, she forgot entirely where she was, until the weight of the previous day settled back over her, the ceremony, the vows, the strange new title she now carried. She rose and dressed carefully, unsure of the household's routines, unsure of her place within walls that had clearly never expected someone like her to walk them. A quiet knock at her door revealed a woman perhaps in her 50s, kind-faced, wearing the simple uniform of household staff. "Good morning, Your Grace," the woman said, dipping into a small, practiced curtsy that made Alina immediately uncomfortable. "I am Margaret, head of household staff. His Grace asked me to see to anything you might need this morning." "Please," Alina said quickly. "Just Alina is fine. I am not entirely used to any of this yet." Margaret's expression softened slightly, something like understanding crossing her face. "That is understandable, given everything. If it helps, His Grace asked specifically that the staff treat you with warmth, not merely formality. He does not often make such requests. I think that says something." Alina felt a small, unexpected warmth at that, following Margaret down to the breakfast room, where Alistair was already seated, looking paler than he had the night before but managing a small, genuine smile as she entered. "Good morning, Duchess," he said, the title still sounding strange and slightly amused in his voice, as though he too was still adjusting to the reality of it. "Good morning, Your Grace," Alina replied, matching his tone, settling into the chair across from him as a member of staff quietly poured tea for them both. Over the following days, the household slowly began adjusting to its new mistress, though not without friction. Some of the older staff regarded Alina with quiet suspicion, unused to a duchess who insisted on learning their names, who thanked them for small tasks rather than expecting silent service, who seemed genuinely uncertain of her place rather than assuming natural authority over them. Marcus, meanwhile, did not disappear quietly after the wedding, as Alistair had hoped he might. Instead, he began appearing at Wintersea Hall with increasing frequency, always under some reasonable pretense, checking on family business matters, offering condolences dressed as concern, watching Alina with careful, calculating attention whenever he believed no one else was paying notice. "He is testing you," Alistair warned Alina one evening as they sat together in the study, a fire crackling low in the grate. "Looking for any weakness he might use, any reason to challenge the marriage's legitimacy. He will not stop simply because the wedding has already happened." "Let him look," Alina said, more confidently than she entirely felt. "He will not find what he is searching for. Whatever this marriage started as, Alistair, I am not pretending anymore. I meant every word of my vows yesterday, even the parts that felt strange to say to someone I had known only a week." Alistair studied her from across the room, firelight catching the sincerity in her expression, and felt something in his chest loosen that had been tight and guarded for as long as he could remember. "I meant mine as well," he said quietly, "every word." Outside, autumn wind pressed against the old windows of Wintersea Hall, and inside, two people who had begun this arrangement as strangers bound by necessity sat together in comfortable silence, each privately beginning to understand that whatever time remained to them, it would not be spent the way either had originally expected. It would be spent, they were both beginning to realize, actually together. A week after the wedding, Alina asked Margaret if she might walk the grounds properly, rather than simply admiring them through windows. Margaret seemed pleasantly surprised by the request and offered to accompany her, pointing out the old rose garden, the stables that had once housed a dozen horses, and the small cluster of cottages at the edge of the estate where several tenant families still lived, their leases passed down through generations alongside the Wintersea title itself. An elderly man named Henry, who had worked the estate's land for over 40 years, stopped his work when he noticed the two women approaching, removing his cap respectfully before Alina could stop him. "You must be the new Duchess," he said, studying her with open curiosity rather than the careful deference she had grown used to indoors. "Heard you married quick. Whole village has been talking of little else." I imagine so, Elena said, feeling a flush of embarrassment despite herself. I hope the talk has not been too unkind. Henry's weathered face broke into an unexpected smile. Mixed opinions, if I am honest with you, Your Grace. Some folks think it strange, a duke marrying so sudden. But His Grace's father and his father before him never once came down to walk among us the way you are doing now, first week in the house. That counts for something, in my opinion. Counts for quite a lot, actually. Elena felt something warm settle in her chest at his words. A small confirmation that perhaps she did have a place here after all, beyond simply the paperwork and the title. She spent nearly an hour talking with Henry and several other tenants, learning names, hearing small complaints about a leaking roof here, a fence needing repair there, matters so ordinary and human that they felt like solid ground beneath her still uncertain footing in this strange new life. That evening, she relayed everything to Alistair over dinner, watching his expression shift from mild surprise to something like quiet pride as she described the conversations, the small requests, the concerns of people he had inherited responsibility for but had rarely met in person himself. My father believed a certain distance was necessary, Alistair admitted, somewhat sheepishly. That familiarity with tenants somehow diminished authority. I confess I never questioned that belief until just now, listening to you. Perhaps authority built on distance is not worth very much in the end, Elena said gently. I think people trust what is close to them, not what hides behind walls and titles. Alistair was quiet for a long moment, turning her words over carefully. Would you consider handling more of the estate's tenant matters directly? I confess my energy is not always reliable these days, and it seems you have already accomplished more genuine goodwill in one afternoon than I managed in years of formal visits. Elena felt a flicker of surprise, then something steadier beneath it. Purpose, perhaps, the first real sense of usefulness she had felt since arriving at Wintersea Hall. I would like that very much, she said honestly. Not everyone in Elena's new life greeted her with such warmth, however. Several miles away, in a townhouse considerably less grand than Wintersea Hall but decorated with the kind of expensive taste that suggested aspiration rather than inherited wealth, Marcus sat across from a private investigator he had hired the very morning after the wedding. I want everything, Marcus said, sliding a folder of basic information across the table, Elena's full name, her previous address, the hospital where she had worked. Family history, financial records, past relationships, anything at all that might suggest this marriage is not what it claims to be. The investigator, a quiet man named Roland with an unremarkable face suited perfectly to his profession, studied the folder briefly before looking up. You believe the marriage is fraudulent? I believe, Marcus said carefully, that a hospital clerk does not simply marry a duke within a week of meeting him without some manner of motive worth examining closely. Perhaps she is exactly what she appears to be. Perhaps she is not. Either way, I intend to know for certain before my cousin's estate slips permanently out of reach, because of a woman no one properly vetted. Roland accepted the assignment without further comment, tucking the folder into his coat. Marcus watched him leave with the quiet satisfaction of a man setting a plan into careful motion, already imagining the various ways such information might prove useful, should the marriage begin producing complications he could exploit. He did not yet know what he might find, but men like Marcus rarely needed the truth to be damning. They needed only enough shadow to plant doubt, and doubt, once planted, had a way of growing roots all its own. Back at Wintersea Hall, unaware of the quiet investigation already unfolding against her, Elena spent her evenings slowly settling into the rhythm of her new life, learning the household's routines, walking the grounds each morning, sitting with Alistair by the fire each evening as the autumn nights grew longer and colder around them. Neither of them spoke often of the 6 months hanging over their marriage like a quiet shadow, though both felt its presence in small ways, in the careful attention Alistair paid to conserving his energy, in the way Elena had begun watching him more closely than she let herself admit, alert to any sign of change in his condition. One evening, as rain pressed steadily against the study windows, Alistair reached for a small wooden box on the side table beside his chair, opening it to reveal an old photograph, worn soft at the edges from handling. "My mother," he said quietly, offering it to Alina. "Taken not long before she left. I do not know why I have kept it all these years, perhaps out of habit more than sentiment." Alina studied the photograph carefully, a young woman with Alistair's same serious eyes, standing stiffly beside a much younger version of the house they now sat within. "She looks unhappy," Alina observed gently. "She was," Alistair admitted, "though I did not understand that as a child. I only understood that one day she was there, and the next she was gone, with no explanation offered to a 9-year-old boy left standing in an enormous house that suddenly felt entirely too large and too quiet." Alina reached across the small space between their chairs and took his hand gently, not offering empty comfort, simply present with him in the weight of the memory. "That explains a great deal," she said softly, "about the distance you keep, about how carefully you guard yourself." Alistair looked down at their joined hands, something unguarded crossing his tired features. "I had not expected to lower that guard again," he admitted quietly. "Certainly not this quickly, and certainly not under circumstances quite like these. And yet here we are." "Here we are," Alina agreed softly, and neither of them pulled their hands away for a long while, as rain continued falling steadily against the old windows of Wintersea Hall, and somewhere beyond its walls, a quiet danger was already beginning to take shape. 3 weeks into the marriage, Alina woke in the middle of the night to the sound of ragged breathing coming from the corridor outside her room. She sat up immediately, heart pounding, and hurried toward the sound, finding Alistair leaning heavily against the wall outside his own bedroom door, one hand pressed to his chest, his face pale and damp with sweat in the dim hallway light. "Alistair," she reached him quickly, sliding an arm around him to help bear his weight. "What is happening? Should I call for the doctor?" "No," he managed, though his voice was strained, breath coming in shallow gasps. "It passes, it always passes. Give it a moment." Alina guided him carefully into his room and onto the edge of the bed, kneeling in front of him, watching helplessly as he fought to steady his breathing, his hand gripping her so tightly it nearly hurt. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an hour, before his breathing finally began to slow, some color returning gradually to his face. "This has happened before," Alina said, once she was certain he could speak without struggling. It was not a question. Alistair did not answer immediately, his eyes fixed on the floor, clearly debating how much honesty to offer. "More frequently lately," he admitted finally. "The doctors warned me the episodes would increase as things progressed. I did not want you to see this. I did not want you to be frightened." "I am your wife," Alina said firmly, though gently. "Not a guest you need to protect from the truth. If I am going to be here with you through this, Alistair, I need you to actually let me be here, rather than hiding the parts that frighten you most." Something in his expression cracked slightly at that, the careful composure he wore like armor slipping just enough for her to see the fear underneath it. Not fear of dying itself, she realized, but fear of becoming a burden, of being seen as weak, of losing the last shreds of control over a body that was slowly failing him despite everything modern medicine could offer. "I am not accustomed to needing anyone," he admitted quietly. "My whole life, I was taught that weakness was something to conceal, not share. Even now, some part of me still wants to hide this from you." "I know," Alina said softly, reaching up to brush a damp strand of hair from his forehead with a tenderness that surprised them both. "But you do not have to anymore, not with me." From that night forward, something between them shifted permanently. Alina began sleeping in the room adjoining his, close enough to hear if another episode came in the night. She learned the small warning signs before they escalated, a particular tightness in his jaw, a slight grayness to his skin, the way his hand would sometimes press briefly against his chest without him seeming to notice he was doing it. She learned when to call the doctor, and when simple presence and patience were what he needed most. In turn, Alistair began letting her further into the parts of himself he had spent a lifetime guarding. He told her about his father's coldness, about years spent trying to earn approval that never fully arrived even after his father's death left him nothing to prove it to. He told her about the loneliness of growing up in a house too large for the small, frightened boy he had once been, raised more by tutors and household staff than by any warmth of family. Alina, in turn, shared pieces of her own life. The mother she had lost too young, the father who had never stayed long enough to matter, the quiet determination that had carried her through nursing school before financial hardship forced her into records work instead, the small dreams she had quietly set aside, because survival had always demanded more immediate attention than ambition. "You wanted to be a nurse," Alastair said one evening, something thoughtful crossing his expression. "Why did you not finish?" "Life happened," Alina said simply, though there was no bitterness in it, only quiet acceptance. "My mother's illness took most of our savings. After she passed, there was no money left for tuition, and I needed steady work immediately. Records seemed practical. It paid the bills, at least." Alastair was quiet for a long moment, something working behind his thoughtful expression. "There is still time," he said finally. "If it is something you still want, there are resources now, Alina, that were not available to you before. I could—" "Alastair," Alina interrupted gently, "you do not need to solve every problem in my life simply because you have the means to do so. Some dreams are allowed to simply be memories, without needing to be fixed." "Perhaps," Alastair said, though something stubborn remained in his expression, "but I would like you to consider it regardless, not as charity. As something that belongs to you, that this marriage should never take away from you, whatever else it demands." Alina felt something tighten warmly in her chest at his insistence, at the genuine care threaded through it rather than mere obligation. She did not answer immediately, but she did not dismiss it either, letting the idea settle somewhere quiet inside her for later consideration. Meanwhile, Marcus's investigation was beginning to yield results, though not the kind he had originally hoped for. Roland delivered his findings on a gray afternoon, sliding a thin folder across the table in Marcus's study. "Nothing scandalous, I am afraid," Roland reported. "Miss Marsh, or rather the Duchess, appears to be exactly what she presents herself as. Modest upbringing, difficult financial history following her mother's death, steady employment record, no significant debts, no previous relationships worth noting, no history of any behavior that would suggest manipulation or fraud." Marcus's jaw tightened with visible frustration. There must be something. No one is entirely without complication. "There is one item," Roland said carefully, "though I am uncertain of its usefulness. Her father abandoned the family when she was young. He resurfaced briefly several years ago, apparently attempting to reconnect, though Miss Marsh reportedly refused all contact. He has, since then, accumulated significant gambling debts, and appears to still be living in London." Marcus considered this information slowly, a thin smile beginning to form at the corners of his mouth. A father with debts and a grudge, freshly discovered that his estranged daughter has married into significant wealth. That, Roland, is not nothing. That is precisely the kind of complication that tends to create very interesting problems, given the right encouragement. "You intend to contact him?" Roland asked, something careful in his tone, aware of the ethical territory Marcus was clearly preparing to step into. "I intend," Marcus said smoothly, "to simply make certain he is aware of his daughter's fortunate circumstances. What he chooses to do with that information is entirely his own business. I am merely being informative." Roland said nothing further, accepting his payment and departing without comment, though something in his expression suggested he understood exactly what kind of trouble Marcus was quietly setting into motion. Back at Wintersea Hall, unaware of the storm Marcus was carefully constructing on the horizon, Alina and Alastair continued settling into a rhythm that neither had expected to find comforting so quickly. Autumn deepened into the first cold edges of winter, and the household staff, watching their Duchess grow more confident, and their Duke grow visibly gentler in her presence, began quietly whispering among themselves that whatever this marriage had started as, it had clearly become something else entirely. One particularly cold evening, Alina found Alistair in the estate's small library, a room she had not yet properly explored, surrounded by towering shelves of leather-bound books that smelled of dust and old paper. He was seated near the fire, a book open on his lap, though his eyes were fixed instead on the flames, lost in some thought he had not yet shared. "You seem far away," Alina observed, settling into the chair beside him. Alistair glanced up, offering a small, tired smile. "I was thinking about time," he admitted. "How strange it is that I spent so many years dreading the emptiness of this house, and now, with so little time left, it feels fuller than it ever has." Alina reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his without hesitation, the gesture now as natural between them as breathing. "I am glad," she said softly, "that I could be part of filling it even for a little while." "A little while," Alistair repeated quietly, something bittersweet threading through his voice. "I find myself wishing more each day that it could be longer." Alina's chest tightened at the honesty in his admission, the quiet ache beneath it that neither of them dared examine too closely most days. "Perhaps it will be," she said, though her voice wavered slightly with the uncertainty neither of them could promise away. "Doctors are not always right about everything, Alistair. There is still hope, even now." Alistair studied her for a long moment, firelight catching the sincerity in her expression, and though he did not entirely believe her words, he found himself grateful for them regardless, grateful for a woman who refused to let hope disappear entirely, even while gently, steadily, learning to hold his hand through whatever came next. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall silently over the grounds of Wintersea Hall, and inside, two people who had begun as strangers bound by necessity sat quietly together by the fire, neither yet aware of the trouble Marcus was carefully assembling against them, both simply grateful, for one more quiet evening, to have found something unexpectedly real in the midst of everything neither had chosen. A few days later, a letter arrived at Wintersea Hall addressed simply to Alina Marsh, the old name striking oddly against the new one she had only just begun growing accustomed to. Margaret delivered it with the rest of the morning post, and Alina's stomach tightened the moment she recognized the handwriting on the envelope, uneven and slanted in a way she had not seen in nearly 6 years. She waited until she was alone in her room before opening it, hands trembling slightly as she unfolded the single page inside. "Alina," it began, no greeting beyond her name, exactly as she remembered him being. "I heard about your marriage. Quite the change in fortune for you. I only wish you had told me yourself, rather than leaving me to hear it through others. I would very much like to see you, to speak properly, perhaps to finally put old troubles behind us. I am your father, after all, whatever has passed between us. I hope you will consider it." The letter was signed simply, Gerald. Alina sat with it for a long time, old memories surfacing unwillingly, a childhood marked by his frequent absences, promises broken more often than kept, and finally, the day he left entirely, offering no explanation beyond a note far shorter than the one she now held. She had not heard from him in years, not since a brief and painful attempt at reconnection that had ended, once again, with him disappearing the moment money became involved. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, uncertain what to do with the tangle of emotions it had stirred loose. She did not mention it to Alistair immediately, though she found herself unusually quiet at dinner that evening, enough that he noticed. "Something is troubling you," he said gently, once the staff had cleared the table and left them alone by the fire. Alina hesitated only briefly before retrieving the letter and handing it to him without further explanation. Alistair read it slowly, his expression darkening with quiet understanding as he reached the end. "You do not have to see him," he said carefully, setting the letter aside. "Not if you do not want to. Whatever he believes he is owed, Alina, he does not have any true claim on your time or your forgiveness." "I know," Alina said softly, "and yet some small part of me still wonders if I should. He is still my father, whatever else he has failed to be." Alistair reached for her hand, his thumb tracing gently over her knuckles. "Whatever you decide, I will support you completely. But I confess, the timing of this letter troubles me. He has not sought you out in years, and suddenly, the moment your circumstances change, he reappears. I do not think that is coincidence." Alina had considered the same uncomfortable possibility herself, though hearing Alistair's voice it aloud made the suspicion feel more solid, more real. "You think someone told him, about the marriage, about the money?" "I think," Alistair said carefully, "that Marcus has not stopped circling simply because the wedding has already happened. I would not put it past him to search for exactly this kind of opportunity." A cold unease settled over the room, the warmth of the evening fire suddenly feeling less comforting than it had moments before. Alina looked down at the letter in her lap, understanding now that whatever peace they had built over these past weeks, it existed inside a fragile bubble that Marcus seemed determined to eventually puncture. "I will not see him," Alina decided finally, folding the letter closed. "Not because I do not care, but because I recognize exactly what this is. I spent years hoping he might change, might come back because he actually wanted to know me, rather than because he wanted something from me. I am not interested in repeating that particular disappointment now, especially not while everything else in my life finally feels steady." Alistair squeezed her hand gently, pride and quiet relief both evident in his expression. "For what it is worth," he said, "I think that is a very brave decision." "It does not feel brave," Alina admitted. "It mostly just feels sad." "Perhaps it can be both," Alistair offered gently, and Alina allowed herself to lean into his shoulder, grateful in that moment for the solid warmth of him beside her, for a partnership that had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, become the steadiest thing in her entire life. Outside, the snow continued falling quietly over the grounds of Wintersea Hall, and somewhere in London, Marcus sat reading a brief, satisfied note from Gerald, confirming that contact had indeed been made. Already turning his attention toward whatever next small crack he might find to widen in the foundation of a marriage he was determined, one way or another, to see fail. Winter settled fully over Wintersea Hall by December, blanketing the grounds in white and forcing the household into a quieter rhythm than the bustling weeks of autumn. Alistair's condition remained stable, though stable, his doctor reminded them gently during a routine visit, was a fragile word, one that could shift without warning at any moment. Alina had grown used to the doctor's visits by now, sitting beside Alistair during each appointment, asking careful questions, learning the language of his condition well enough that she sometimes anticipated the doctor's explanations before he finished offering them. It was, she realized one evening, not unlike the nursing path she had once abandoned, this steady accumulation of medical understanding born entirely out of necessity and love rather than formal training. "You would have made an excellent nurse," Dr. Whitfield told her one afternoon, after Alistair had gone to rest following a particularly thorough examination. "You ask better questions than most junior doctors I have trained." Alina smiled, though something bittersweet lingered beneath it. "Perhaps in another life. Perhaps in this one, once things settle," Dr. Whitfield offered kindly, before excusing himself, leaving Alina alone with thoughts she still had not fully allowed herself to explore. That evening, as snow fell steadily outside the study windows, Alistair broached a subject neither of them had spoken of directly since the earliest days of their arrangement. "We have been married nearly 2 months," he said carefully, settling into the chair across from her by the fire. "I do not wish to pressure you, Alina, truly I do not, but I think we should discuss honestly the matter of an heir. Time is not something either of us can afford to treat carelessly." Alina had known this conversation was coming, had turned it over privately more nights than she could count, wrestling with feelings far more complicated than the simple practical arrangement it had first been framed as. "I know," she said quietly. "I have been thinking of it too, though I confess, it feels different now than it did the day you first proposed this entire arrangement." "Different how?" Alistair asked gently. Alina considered her words carefully before answering. At first, it felt like a transaction, a necessary step in an agreement between two strangers. Now, she paused, searching for honesty rather than convenient phrasing. "Now it feels like something I actually want, not simply because the estate requires it, but because some part of me wants to have a piece of you in this world, Alistair, regardless of what happens to either of us." Something raw and unguarded crossed Alistair's expression at her words, emotion he did not attempt to hide. "I feel the same," he admitted quietly. "I did not expect to when this began. I thought I would simply be fulfilling an obligation. Instead, I find myself hoping, quite desperately, for a child who might carry forward some part of everything I have come to feel for you." The words hung warm and heavy in the space between them, neither entirely a declaration of love nor entirely separate from one. Elena crossed the small distance between their chairs and settled beside him, his arm coming around her naturally, both of them quiet for a long moment, listening to the fire crackle and the wind press softly against the old windows. "I am frightened," Elena admitted softly into the quiet. "Not of the child, of everything that comes after if things do not go the way we are hoping." "I know," Alistair said, his voice equally soft. "I am frightened too. But I would rather spend whatever time remains being frightened together with you, than spend it alone, pretending none of this touches me at all." Elena tilted her head up to look at him, and something shifted quietly between them, unspoken but understood completely. A bridge crossed that neither of them could fully articulate, but both felt deeply nonetheless. In the weeks that followed, their relationship deepened in ways that surprised them both with their gentleness. What had begun as careful, deliberate partnership slowly softened into something that resembled, more and more with each passing day, an actual marriage built on genuine affection rather than mere necessity. Small moments accumulated between them, Alistair teaching her to properly pour tea in the old formal style his grandmother had once insisted upon, Elena teaching him, in turn, small practical skills he had never needed to learn, like mending a torn seam or making a simple meal without staff assistance, both of them laughing more easily than either had expected their circumstances would allow. By late January, Elena began noticing small changes in herself, a persistent tiredness beyond what stress alone could explain, a sensitivity to certain smells that had never bothered her before. She said nothing at first, wary of hoping too quickly, until finally, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, she visited Dr. Whitfield privately during one of his regular visits to the estate. The confirmation, when it came, left her sitting quietly in the small examination room for several minutes afterward, one hand resting instinctively against her still flat stomach, tears gathering that she could not entirely explain even to herself. Relief, fear, and a fierce, sudden protectiveness all tangled together at once. She found Alistair in the study that evening, and something in her expression must have given away the news before she spoke a single word, because he rose immediately from his chair, concern and hope warring visibly across his face. "Elena, what is it?" "I am pregnant," she said simply, the words feeling enormous and fragile all at once in the quiet room. For a long moment, Alistair simply stared at her, as though the words needed time to fully settle into reality. Then slowly, an expression crossed his face that Elena had not seen from him before, pure, unguarded joy, breaking through months of careful composure entirely. He crossed the room quickly and gathered her gently into his arms, careful and reverent, as though she had suddenly become something infinitely precious and fragile all at once. "Elena," he breathed against her hair, voice rough with emotion. Thank you truly for this." "You do not need to thank me," Elena said, laughing softly through unexpected tears of her own. "We did this together." Alistair pulled back slightly, cupping her face gently in both hands, studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I know I asked you into this arrangement for the sake of the estate," he said quietly. "But Elena, I want you to know, whatever happens from this moment forward, this child is not merely an heir to me. This child is ours, born from something I have come to feel far more deeply than I ever expected to feel again in whatever time I have left." "I know," Elena said softly, resting her forehead gently against his. "I feel it too." The news spread quietly through the household over the following days, met with genuine warmth from staff who had come to care for their young duchess, despite the strangeness of her arrival months before. Margaret nearly cried when Alina told her personally, immediately beginning to fuss over what changes might need making to accommodate a nursery. Her excitement infectious despite the underlying uncertainty, everyone in the household carefully avoided speaking aloud. Word reached Marcus within the week, delivered by a servant loyal to him among the estate staff, someone Marcus had quietly cultivated as a source of information since shortly after the wedding. He received the news in his study with considerably less warmth than the household at Wintersea Hall had shown. "A child," he said flatly, staring out his window at the grey London street below. "How remarkably convenient." "Should I continue monitoring the situation, sir?" the servant asked carefully. "Yes," Marcus said, something cold settling into his expression. "Closely. If there is any complication at all with this pregnancy, any risk, any weakness in the timeline, I want to know immediately. An heir secures everything for them. I do not intend to simply stand by and watch 300 years of family inheritance slip permanently beyond my reach because a hospital clerk got herself pregnant quickly enough." The servant nodded and departed, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts, already turning over new possibilities, new angles he might exploit should circumstances allow. He was not a man accustomed to losing, and the growing warmth and stability at Wintersea Hall represented, to him, nothing more than an obstacle still waiting to be dismantled. Back at the estate, unaware of the cold calculations already forming against them, Alastair and Alina spent the following weeks adjusting to the reality of impending parenthood, with a tenderness neither had expected circumstances to allow. Alastair, despite his declining strength, insisted on accompanying Alina to every medical appointment, holding her hand through each examination, his face lighting with quiet wonder the first time they heard the faint, rapid heartbeat of their child confirmed through the doctor's equipment. "That is remarkable," he murmured, gripping Alina's hand tightly, eyes fixed on the small monitor as though he could will strength into his own failing body simply by witnessing the strong, steady rhythm of new life beginning within her. "Truly remarkable." Dr. Whitfield, observing the couple's evident joy, allowed himself a small, private smile before returning to his clinical notes. "Everything looks healthy so far," he confirmed. "We will, of course, monitor things closely given the circumstances, but there is no immediate cause for concern." That evening, back at Wintersea Hall, Alastair sat with Alina in the nursery that Margaret had already begun preparing, despite the many months still remaining before the child's arrival. He ran his hand gently over the smooth wood of an old cradle, one that had been used by generations of Wintersea children before them, carefully restored for this newest addition to the family line. "I used to hate this house," he admitted quietly, staring at the cradle with an expression Alina had never quite seen on him before, something soft, something almost young beneath the weight of illness and duty he usually carried. "I hated its silence, its coldness, the way it seemed built more for appearances than for actual living. I never imagined I would feel this way about it. Hopeful rather than trapped." Alina moved to stand beside him, resting her head against his shoulder, one hand settling naturally over the small, still flat curve of her stomach. "Perhaps the house was never the problem," she said softly. "Perhaps it simply needed the right people inside it, to finally feel like a home instead of a monument." Alastair turned to look at her, something fierce and tender combined in his gaze. "I love you," he said quietly, the words emerging simply, without hesitation or performance, as though they had been building steadily beneath the surface for weeks, finally finding their way naturally into the open air between them. "I did not expect to. I certainly did not plan for it when I first arrived at your doorstep with an absurd proposal and far too little time. But I do, Alina, completely." Alina's eyes filled with tears she did not try to hold back, her heart feeling almost too full to contain everything rushing through it at once. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have for longer than I let myself admit." They stood together in the quiet nursery, snow falling steadily beyond the windows, a small new life growing quietly between them, and for the first time since this entire arrangement had begun, neither of them thought of the 6 months as a countdown toward an ending. For the first time, It simply felt like the beginning of something neither of them intended to let go without a fight. The peace of that winter evening did not last uninterrupted for long. 2 weeks later, Alistair collapsed while walking the east corridor toward his study, his legs simply giving out beneath him without warning. A passing member of staff found him and raised the alarm immediately, and within minutes, the quiet household erupted into controlled chaos, Alina rushing down the stairs so quickly she nearly lost her footing herself. She found him conscious but pale, propped against the wall where 2 footmen had carefully positioned him, his breathing shallow and his eyes struggling to focus properly. "I am fine," he managed, though the words came weakly. "Simply lightheaded. It will pass." "You are not fine," Alina said firmly, kneeling beside him, her hands trembling as she checked his pulse the way Dr. Whitfield had taught her weeks before. "Someone call the doctor immediately." "Now please." The following hours passed in a blur of medical urgency, Dr. Whitfield arriving within the hour. A thorough examination conducted in Alistair's bedroom, hushed conversations in the corridor that Alina insisted on being included in, refusing to be shielded from information any longer regardless of how difficult it might prove to hear. "His condition has progressed somewhat faster than we initially projected," Dr. Whitfield explained carefully, once Alistair had been settled comfortably and given something to help him rest. "This episode was not entirely unexpected, given the trajectory, but I will be honest with you both, the margin we are working within has narrowed." Alina felt the floor seem to shift slightly beneath her, though she kept her composure through sheer determination alone. "What does that mean, precisely?" Dr. Whitfield hesitated, clearly weighing how much bluntness the moment required. "It means the original estimate of 6 to 8 months may prove optimistic if his condition continues along this current path. I am sorry to say it so plainly, but I believe you both deserve honesty rather than false comfort." The words settled like ice through Alina's chest, and for a moment she could not speak at all, simply staring at the doctor as the fragile hope of recent weeks threatened to collapse entirely beneath the weight of harder reality. "Is there nothing else to try?" she finally asked, voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "No treatment, no option we have not yet explored." Dr. Whitfield paused, something careful entering his expression. "There are experimental approaches, still in early clinical trials, not yet widely available or fully proven. I have hesitated to raise them before now, given the risks and uncertainties involved, and given how firmly His Grace insisted, early in his diagnosis, that he wished to avoid what he called false hope." "Tell me about them," Alina said immediately, something fierce and unwilling to surrender kindling behind her exhaustion. "Please, I do not care about false hope right now, Dr. Whitfield. I care about giving him every possible chance, whatever the risk." Dr. Whitfield studied her for a long moment, something like quiet respect forming behind his professional composure. "I will gather what information I can," he said finally. "Though I must be clear, Alina, this decision ultimately belongs to Alistair. I can present options. I cannot force him to choose hope over the peace he believed he had already made with his circumstances." Alina nodded, understanding completely, though determination had already settled firmly into her chest, a resolve she did not intend to abandon regardless of how difficult the coming conversation with Alistair might prove to be. That night, once Alistair had rested enough to speak clearly again, Alina sat beside his bed, holding his hand, and told him gently but firmly everything Dr. Whitfield had shared. Alistair listened quietly, exhaustion and something like resignation evident in his expression by the time she finished. "I made peace with 6 months, Alina," he said softly. "I do not know if I have the strength left to chase false hope, only to have it collapse and leave you grieving twice over instead of once." "This is not about false hope," Alina said, gripping his hand tighter, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "This is about giving yourself every chance to stay, Alistair. Not just for the estate, not just for the heir you needed. For yourself. For me. For a child who deserves the chance to actually know their father, rather than simply inherit stories about him." Alistair's eyes glistened in the low lamplight, emotion visibly warring within him. "I am frightened," he admitted quietly, "of hoping and losing that hope all over again." "I know," Alina said gently, pressing his hand against her cheek. "I am frightened too. But I would rather be frightened while fighting for more time with you than calm because I convinced myself surrender was easier. Please, Alistair, consider it, not for anyone else's sake, for your own." Alistair was quiet for a long time, the weight of her words settling slowly through the fatigue and fear that had governed his thinking for months. Finally, he nodded, something small but real shifting in his expression. "All right," he said softly, "for you, I will consider it." Alina leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead, relief and renewed determination flooding through her chest in equal measure. Outside, the winter night pressed cold and quiet against the windows of Wintersea Hall, but inside, a fragile new resolve had begun taking root, one that neither Marcus's schemes nor the doctor's cautious warnings would be permitted to extinguish without a fight. February arrived cold and unforgiving, but inside Wintersea Hall, a fragile new determination had settled over the household. Alistair, true to his word, agreed to explore the experimental treatment Dr. Whitfield had cautiously described, a targeted therapy still undergoing clinical trials, designed to strengthen heart function in patients whose conditions had progressed beyond conventional surgical options. The treatment carried real risks, no guarantees, and a cost significant enough that Dr. Whitfield admitted most patients pursuing it required considerable financial resources simply to access trial programs still limited in availability. "Cost is not a concern," Alistair said immediately, when the doctor raised the matter carefully. "Whatever resources are required, secure them. I only need to know if there is a genuine chance of benefit, not simply an expensive illusion of one." Dr. Whitfield nodded, making notes. "The trial data so far is promising, though limited. I would not call it a certainty by any means. But it is, I believe, a reasonable chance worth pursuing, given your circumstances." Alina sat beside Alistair through the entire conversation, her hand steady in his despite the uncertainty hanging over every word exchanged. When the doctor finally left to begin arranging the necessary approvals, she turned to Alistair, searching his expression carefully. "How do you feel?" she asked softly. "Frightened," Alistair admitted honestly. "But also, for the first time in months, something close to hopeful. I had not realized how much I missed that particular feeling until it returned." Alina smiled, though tears gathered unexpectedly in her eyes. "Good," she said simply. "Hold on to it. We will hold on to it together." The weeks that followed brought a flurry of arrangements, additional medical consultations, careful coordination with the clinical trial administrators, adjustments to accommodate the physical demands the treatment would place on Alistair's already weakened body. Through it all, Alina remained a constant, steady presence, learning everything she could about the treatment's process and risks, determined to understand every aspect of what her husband was about to undergo. Their relationship, already deepened by months of shared vulnerability, grew steadier still through this new chapter of cautious hope. Alistair found himself leaning on Alina in ways he had never permitted himself to lean on anyone before, and rather than feeling weakened by the dependence, he discovered instead a quiet, unexpected strength in simply allowing himself to be cared for. "I used to believe strength meant needing no one," he admitted one evening, as Alina helped him settle into bed after a particularly exhausting day of medical appointments. "I understand now how wrong that belief was. There is nothing weak about this, about you, about needing someone who actually stays." Alina pressed a gentle kiss to his temple, her heart full despite the exhaustion evident in both their faces. "There never was," she said softly. "You simply needed someone patient enough to show you that." Not everyone shared in the household's cautious optimism, however. Word of the experimental treatment reached Marcus within days, delivered once again through his quiet network of informants among the estate staff. He received the news with visible frustration, pacing his study for a long while before finally summoning Roland once more. They are pursuing treatment, Marcus said flatly once Roland arrived. Some experimental therapy. If it succeeds, even partially, Alistair's timeline extends considerably, and my entire strategy becomes worthless. You believe he might actually recover? Roland asked carefully. I believe, Marcus said. That hope is a dangerous thing for my interests, regardless of whether it ultimately succeeds. I need to accelerate my own plans before this treatment has time to change anything. What did you have in mind? Roland asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected he would not entirely approve of the answer. Marcus's expression sharpened into something calculated and cold. The marriage itself, I wanted examined more closely. The speed of it, the circumstances, the fact that Alina had no legal counsel of her own during the initial arrangement. If there is any procedural weakness at all, any grounds to challenge its legitimacy, I want it found and prepared before that child is even born. Roland studied him for a long moment. You intend to contest the marriage's validity? I intend, Marcus said, to explore every avenue available to me. Family loyalty extends only so far when 300 years of inheritance hang in the balance. I did not choose this fight, Roland. Alistair chose it for me, the moment he decided a hospital clerk deserved everything I have spent my entire life believing I would eventually inherit. Roland accepted the new assignment without further comment. Though his expression carried a weight of reluctance he did not voice aloud. He had begun to suspect, over recent weeks, that Marcus's ambitions had grown considerably darker than simple financial concern, though professional obligation kept him from acting on that unease just yet. Meanwhile, at Wintersea Hall, Alina's pregnancy progressed steadily through the difficult early months, morning sickness giving way gradually to a fragile, growing energy as her body adjusted to the changes taking root within her. She found herself increasingly drawn to the estate's tenant families, continuing the visits she had begun in her earliest days as Duchess, now accompanied by a small, growing bump beneath her coat that the villagers greeted with genuine warmth and excitement. The whole village has taken to calling you the people's Duchess, Margaret told her one afternoon, smiling as she helped Alina into her coat before another visit to the tenant cottages. First Duchess in generations who has actually bothered learning their names, their troubles, their children's names too, from what I hear. Alina flushed slightly at the praise, though pride warmed steadily beneath her embarrassment. I only did what seemed decent, she said simply. I do not understand why that should be so remarkable. Because it rarely is in houses like this one, Margaret said gently. You have brought something to this family that has been missing for a very long time, Your Grace. I hope you know that. The word stayed with Alina through the following weeks, a quiet confirmation of the purpose she had slowly built for herself within a life that had begun as pure necessity and had grown, gradually, into something she genuinely valued and wished to protect. In late February, Alistair underwent the first phase of his experimental treatment, a process that left him weakened and exhausted for several days afterward, but showed early, cautiously encouraging signs according to Dr. Whitfield's careful monitoring. Alina stayed by his bedside through the worst of the recovery, holding his hand through fevered nights, reading to him quietly during the long, tired afternoons, refusing to leave his side despite gentle suggestions from staff that she consider her own health and rest given her pregnancy. I am not going anywhere, she told Margaret firmly, when the older woman gently raised the concern. Not while he needs me here. By early March, Alistair's strength had begun returning in small but noticeable increments. Color returning more steadily to his face, episodes of breathlessness growing slightly less frequent, enough improvement that even the normally cautious Dr. Whitfield allowed himself a small note of guarded optimism during his next examination. It is too early to declare anything with certainty, he cautioned, though a smile tugged at the corner of his usually composed expression. But this is more encouraging than I initially anticipated. Whatever you are doing at home to support his recovery, continue it. Alina felt something loosen in her chest that had been tightly wound for months, relief flooding through her so completely that she found herself crying quietly in the corridor after the doctor departed, Alistair's hand finding hers gently as he joined her. "Good tears, I hope," he said softly, worry creasing his brow despite his own visible improvement. "Very good tears," Alina confirmed, laughing through them despite herself. "I am simply so relieved, Alistair. I did not realize how tightly I had been holding my breath these past months until just now, finally allowing myself to exhale." Alistair pulled her gently into his arms, resting his cheek against her hair, both of them standing quietly together in the corridor, allowing themselves, for the first time in what felt like a very long while, to simply believe in the possibility of a future neither had dared imagine when this arrangement first began. That fragile hope, however, would not remain unchallenged for long. 2 weeks later, a formal letter arrived at Wintersea Hall from a legal firm neither Alina nor Alistair recognized, addressed directly to Alistair's solicitor, Edmund Hale. Edmund arrived at the estate personally to deliver the news, his expression grave as he settled into the study across from the couple. "Marcus has filed a formal legal challenge," Edmund explained carefully, "questioning the validity of your marriage. He is arguing that the speed of the arrangement, combined with Alina's lack of independent legal counsel at the time, suggests possible undue influence given your medical condition at the time of the proposal." Alina felt the color drain from her face, one hand instinctively moving to rest protectively over the growing curve of her stomach. "He is claiming I manipulated him," she said quietly, disbelief and anger tangling together in her voice. "That the marriage itself might not even be legitimate." "That is the essence of his argument, yes," Edmund confirmed grimly. "It is, in my professional opinion, a weak claim, given the clear documentation we prepared at the time, including independent medical assessments confirming Alistair's full mental capacity throughout the proceedings. However, weak claims can still cause considerable delay and complication if pursued aggressively through the courts, particularly given the significant inheritance at stake." Alistair's expression had hardened into something Alina had rarely seen from him before: controlled fury, simmering carefully beneath his composed exterior. "He would truly attempt this," he said quietly, "even now, even with a child on the way, simply to protect his own ambitions." "I am afraid so, Your Grace," Edmund confirmed. "I would recommend we respond swiftly and firmly, gathering additional documentation and witness testimony to reinforce the marriage's legitimacy beyond any reasonable challenge." Alina sat quietly for a long moment, processing the fresh threat now hanging over everything they had built together, before something steady and determined settled firmly into her expression. "Let him try," she said finally, her voice steady despite the anger still coursing through her. "We have done nothing wrong, Alistair, nothing dishonest, nothing manipulated. If Marcus wants to fight this in court, then we fight back, with everything we have." Alistair looked at her with something like fierce admiration crossing his tired features, reaching for her hand and gripping it firmly. "Together," he said quietly. "Together," Alina confirmed, and though the road ahead had suddenly grown considerably more difficult, neither of them intended to face it as anything less than fully united against whatever Marcus still had planned. Edmund began preparing their formal response immediately, gathering witness statements from Margaret, from Dr. Whitfield confirming Alistair's mental capacity throughout the proceedings, from Henry and several other tenants who could speak to the genuine warmth and legitimacy of the relationship they had personally observed developing at the estate. Slowly, methodically, a strong defense began taking shape against Marcus's calculated challenge. Meanwhile, Marcus himself grew increasingly frustrated as news filtered back to him regarding both Alistair's improving health and the strength of the legal defense being assembled against his claim. He met with Roland once more, his composure fraying slightly at the edges despite his usual careful control. "This is not proceeding as anticipated," Marcus admitted, something almost desperate creeping into his usually confident demeanor. "Alistair's health is improving. The legal challenge is weaker than I had hoped. I need something more substantial, Roland. something that cannot simply be defended away with witness statements and medical documentation. Roland studied his employer carefully, unease deepening visibly in his expression. "Mr. Wintersea, I would caution strongly against pursuing anything beyond legitimate legal or investigative means. Whatever additional pressure you are considering, I would advise you reconsider the risks involved, both legal and otherwise." Marcus waved away the warning impatiently, his mind already turning toward more drastic measures, unwilling to accept defeat now that everything he had spent years anticipating seemed to be slipping steadily further from his grasp. Whatever scruples had once tempered his ambition had begun eroding entirely beneath the mounting frustration of watching Alistair and Alina's improbable partnership grow stronger with each passing week. Rather than collapsing the way he had originally, confidently predicted it would. Marcus arrived at Wintersea Hall unannounced on a cold afternoon in mid-March, claiming he wished to discuss the legal matter directly rather than solely through solicitors. Alina, alone in the study when he was shown in, felt her spine stiffen immediately at the sight of him, though she kept her expression carefully composed. "You have no appointment," she said evenly. "Alistair is resting. I do not think this is an appropriate time for a visit." "I did not come to see Alistair," Marcus said smoothly, settling uninvited into a chair across from her desk. "I came to speak with you directly, Duchess. Woman to woman, as it were, without solicitors complicating things unnecessarily." "There is nothing you have to say to me that requires privacy," Alina said coolly, though her pulse had quickened despite her outward composure. Marcus studied her for a long moment, something calculating shifting behind his practiced smile. "I simply want to understand your true intentions," he said. "You must admit, the entire arrangement remains rather extraordinary. A hospital clerk marrying a dying duke within a week of a single brief encounter. Even now, carrying his child, poised to inherit everything regardless of how this legal challenge resolves. I find myself wondering what a woman in your position might accept to simply simplify matters for everyone involved." Alina's eyes narrowed, understanding dawning slowly and unpleasantly. "Are you attempting to bribe me, Marcus?" "I am offering a mutually beneficial arrangement," Marcus said, unbothered by her bluntness. "A generous settlement, quietly negotiated, in exchange for you withdrawing from this marriage before matters become unnecessarily complicated in court. You would want for nothing, Alina. Financial security, without the burden of watching a man die slowly in front of you, without the complication of raising a child within a family that has never truly welcomed you as anything more than a convenient solution to a temporary problem." Alina rose slowly from her chair, anger burning steady and controlled beneath her calm exterior. "You believe I married Alistair for financial security," she said quietly. "You believe everything in this world can simply be purchased, moved, discarded, whenever convenient to your own ambitions. I do not know what kind of woman you assumed I was, Marcus, when you began investigating my background so thoroughly. But I promise you, whatever you found, you clearly did not understand what you were looking at." Marcus's smile faltered slightly, something colder replacing it. "I understand ambition when I see it," he said, standing as well, his composure cracking just enough to reveal genuine frustration beneath it. "I understand a woman who found herself an extraordinary opportunity and seized it cleverly. I do not fault you for that, Alina. I simply believe you should recognize when it is time to accept a graceful exit, before this becomes considerably more difficult for everyone involved, including the child you are carrying." The implied threat in his final words settled cold and unmistakable in the quiet study. Alina's hand moved instinctively to rest over her stomach, protective fury sharpening every word that followed. "Get out of my house," she said, voice low and absolutely steady. "Now, Marcus, and do not return again without proper notice and legitimate business, because I promise you, whatever threats you believe you are entitled to make, I will not allow them anywhere near my child." For a moment, Marcus simply stared at her, clearly unaccustomed to being spoken to with such unwavering resolve. Then, straightening his coat with exaggerated composure, he offered a small, cold bow. As you wish, Duchess, though I would advise you reconsider your position before matters progress much further. Not every battle is worth fighting to its bitter end. He left without further comment, and Alina remained standing alone in the study for several long minutes afterward, hands trembling now that the confrontation had ended, adrenaline slowly giving way to genuine fear at the thinly veiled threat he had left hanging in the air. She told Alistair everything that evening, watching his expression shift from concern to controlled fury as she recounted the conversation in careful detail. "He threatened our child," Alistair said quietly, something dangerous entering his tone that Alina had never heard from him before. "Directly in our own home." "I do not think he intends violence," Alina said carefully, though uncertainty colored her own voice. "I believe he intends pressure, manipulation, perhaps further legal complications. But Alistair, I would rather we assume the worst and prepare accordingly, than dismiss it and regret that dismissal later." Alistair nodded grimly, already reaching for the telephone to contact Edmund immediately. "We will increase security around the estate," he said firmly. "And I will make certain Edmund understands exactly what Marcus attempted today. A bribery attempt, combined with an implied threat toward my wife and unborn child, changes the nature of this conflict considerably. I do not intend to let him continue operating in shadows any longer." That night, as new security measures were quietly arranged around Wintersea Hall, Alina lay awake beside Alistair, one hand resting protectively over her stomach, the other held firmly in his. Whatever peace they had built together over these past months now existed under clear and present threat, and both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, that the coming weeks would demand more courage from them than anything they had yet faced. "We will get through this," Alistair murmured into the darkness, his voice steady despite the exhaustion of the day. "Whatever he attempts next, Alina, I promise you, we will face it together and we will win." Alina squeezed his hand gently in the darkness, drawing strength from his certainty even as her own heart still raced with residual fear. "Together," she whispered back, and slowly, gradually, sleep eventually claimed them both, though neither rested entirely easily, aware that the true test of everything they had built was still, unmistakably, yet to come. The following weeks brought a tense, watchful calm to Wintersea Hall. Additional security patrolled the grounds discreetly. Edmund pressed forward aggressively with the legal defense against Marcus's challenge, and Alistair continued his experimental treatment with results that Dr. Whitfield now described, with increasing confidence, as genuinely encouraging. "Your heart function has improved measurably," the doctor explained during a checkup in early April, reviewing test results with visible satisfaction. "I want to remain cautious in my language, because these things can still change, but I am considerably more optimistic than I was 3 months ago. If this trend continues, we may be looking at a significantly longer timeline than originally projected. Possibly, though I stress this remains uncertain, a genuine path toward long-term stability." Alina gripped Alistair's hand tightly, hope and fear tangled together so completely she could hardly separate one from the other. "How much longer?" she asked carefully. "I cannot promise specifics," Dr. Whitfield said honestly. "But months have become, cautiously, something that might stretch toward years, provided the treatment continues responding as it currently is. I would not have believed this possible, based on where things stood in November." Alistair sat quietly absorbing the news, something complicated crossing his features, relief, disbelief, and beneath it all, a flicker of fear that hope itself might yet prove premature. "I do not wish to celebrate prematurely," he said carefully. "But I confess, Dr. Whitfield, this is more than I allowed myself to hope for." "Hope carefully, then," the doctor said with a small, warm smile. "But hope nonetheless. You have earned that much at least." Walking out of the appointment together, Alina found herself crying quietly in the corridor for the second time in months, though these tears carried a lightness the earlier ones had not. "Do you understand what this means?" she said, laughing through her tears despite herself. "You might actually get to watch our child grow up, Alistair. You might actually get years, not months." Alistair pulled her gently into his arms, resting his chin against her hair, his own composure clearly fraying with emotion he no longer bothered concealing. "I understand," he said softly, "that I have never in my entire life had more reason to fight for a future than I do right now, standing here with you." Their renewed hope, however, arrived alongside continued pressure from Marcus's legal challenge, which, despite Edmund's confident defense, had dragged the couple through several difficult weeks of depositions, document reviews, and careful preparation for a court hearing scheduled for late April. Alina, now visibly pregnant and increasingly protective of the fragile stability they had built, found the process exhausting, though she refused to let it diminish her resolve. "He is grasping at anything now," Edmund reported during a strategy meeting held in the study, 2 weeks before the scheduled hearing. "His legal argument regarding the marriage's validity has grown considerably weaker under scrutiny, particularly given the extensive documentation of your relationship's genuine development over these past months. I am confident we will prevail in court." "And if he continues pursuing other avenues, outside the courtroom?" Alastair asked pointedly, still visibly troubled by the confrontation Marcus had staged with Alina weeks earlier. Edmund's expression grew more serious. "That, I am afraid, remains a separate concern entirely. I would recommend documenting any further contact or threats carefully, and involving proper authorities immediately should anything cross clearly into criminal territory." That warning proved prescient sooner than any of them anticipated. 3 days before the scheduled hearing, Roland arrived unannounced at Wintersea Hall, requesting a private meeting with Alastair rather than Marcus, his expression carrying none of the professional detachment he had maintained throughout his work for Marcus over recent months. "I need to speak with you honestly, Your Grace," Roland said, once he had been shown into the study, glancing nervously toward the door as though concerned about being followed. "I have continued investigative work for Mr. Wintersea over recent weeks, work that has grown considerably beyond what I originally agreed to undertake." Alastair studied him carefully. "Go on." Roland took a steadying breath. "Mr. Wintersea has instructed me to gather information intended to discredit Dr. Whitfield's medical assessments of your mental capacity at the time of your marriage. When I refused, citing ethical concerns, he indicated he intended to pursue the matter through other channels. More concerning, Your Grace, he has also discussed, in my presence, contacting members of the press with a fabricated narrative suggesting your wife orchestrated the entire marriage deliberately, exploiting your vulnerable medical condition for financial gain. I believe he intends to pursue this regardless of the court's eventual ruling, simply to damage your reputation and hers beyond repair." Alastair's expression darkened considerably, controlled anger simmering visibly beneath his composed exterior. "Why are you telling me this now, Roland, rather than continuing your work for him quietly?" Roland hesitated, something like genuine shame crossing his features. "Because I have a daughter myself, Your Grace, close to Mrs. Thorne's age. I have watched Mr. Wintersea's ambitions grow increasingly reckless over these past months, watched him move from legitimate investigation into something considerably darker. I cannot, in good conscience, continue assisting him further. I came here today because I believe you deserve to know what you are truly facing before it escalates beyond what any of us can control." Alastair sat quietly for a long moment, processing the full weight of Roland's confession. "Would you be willing to provide a formal statement to my solicitor, documenting everything you have just told me?" Roland nodded slowly. "I would. I understand this likely damages my own professional standing considerably, coming forward this way. But I find I would rather live with that consequence than continue enabling whatever Mr. Wintersea intends to do next." Edmund was summoned immediately, and Roland's formal statement was recorded that same afternoon, providing exactly the kind of evidence needed to demonstrate Marcus's challenge had been pursued not out of legitimate legal concern, but through a deliberate campaign of manipulation and intimidation against Alastair and Alina both. When the hearing finally convened 3 days later, Marcus arrived confident and composed, clearly unaware that Roland's defection had fundamentally altered the ground beneath his entire legal strategy. Edmund presented the couple's defense methodically, witness statements from Margaret, from Henry, from Dr. Whitfield confirming Alastair's full mental capacity throughout the marriage proceedings, and finally, devastatingly, Roland's sworn statement detailing Marcus's escalating campaign of manipulation, from the letter sent to Alina's estranged father, to the bribery attempt in the study at Wintersea Hall, to the fabricated press narrative he had been actively preparing. Marcus's composure cracked visibly as Roland's statement was read aloud in the courtroom, his face draining of color as the judge's expression shifted from careful neutrality to open disapproval. His own solicitor, clearly caught entirely off guard by the revelation, requested a brief recess to consult privately with his client, though the damage, by that point, had already been thoroughly and irreversibly done. The judge's ruling, delivered later that same afternoon, dismissed Marcus's challenge entirely, characterizing it as an opportunistic and ultimately baseless attempt to exploit a vulnerable medical situation for personal financial gain, and further noted the court's serious concern regarding the pattern of manipulation and intimidation documented in Roland's testimony, recommending the matter be referred for further investigation regarding potential criminal harassment charges. Alina sat beside Alastair throughout the ruling, gripping his hand tightly, relief flooding through her so completely she could barely process the full weight of what had just occurred. When the judge finally concluded, Alastair turned to her, something like pure, unguarded joy breaking across his tired but increasingly healthy features. "It is over," he said quietly, disbelief still evident in his voice. "Alina, it is finally over." Outside the courthouse, as they made their way toward the waiting car, Marcus intercepted them briefly, his usual composed arrogance entirely absent, replaced instead by something haggard and defeated. "Alastair," he said quietly, "I know I have no right to ask anything of you after everything I have attempted. But please believe that this was never truly about hatred toward you. It was fear. Fear of being left with nothing, the way I always assumed I eventually would be." Alastair studied his cousin for a long moment, old resentment and something almost like pity warring within him. "Fear does not excuse cruelty, Marcus," he said finally, though his voice carried less anger than exhaustion. "You threatened my wife, my unborn child. I do not know if I can ever forgive that fully. But I hope, genuinely, that you eventually find whatever peace you were truly searching for, in a way that does not require destroying someone else's happiness to achieve it." He did not wait for Marcus's response, guiding Alina gently toward the car instead, leaving his cousin standing alone on the courthouse steps, the weight of his own choices finally, fully settling upon him. That evening, back at Wintersea Hall, Alina and Alastair sat together in the nursery, now nearly complete, sunlight streaming warm and golden through the windows despite the lingering chill of early spring outside. Alastair rested one hand gently against Alina's rounded stomach, feeling the small, determined movements of their child beneath his palm, wonder and gratitude visible in every line of his increasingly healthy face. "We did it," Alina said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "We actually did it, Alastair." "We did," he agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "Though I think, if I am honest, the real victory was never the court case or even the estate itself. The real victory was finding you, Alina, finding something worth fighting this hard to keep." Alina turned to look at him, tears gathering happily in her eyes, and pressed a gentle kiss to his lips, the future stretching open and hopeful before them for the first time since this entire impossible journey had begun. Outside, spring was finally beginning to bloom across the grounds of Wintersea Hall, and inside, two people who had started as strangers bound by desperate necessity now sat together as something far more precious. A family, finally, truly beginning. In the weeks following the hearing, the criminal investigation into Marcus's conduct proceeded quietly in the background, resulting eventually in a formal caution regarding harassment and attempted extortion, along with a court order barring him from any further contact with either Alastair or Alina, without explicit legal representation present. He did not contest the ruling. Whatever fight had once driven him seemed to have finally, entirely drained away. Replaced by a subdued withdrawal from the family matters he had spent years trying desperately to control. Grace visited Wintersea Hall for the first time since the wedding, arriving on a bright April afternoon and immediately pulling Alina into a fierce, relieved embrace the moment she stepped through the door. "I have been so worried," Grace admitted, pulling back to study her friend properly, taking in the visible pregnancy, the healthier color in Alina's cheeks, the quiet contentment now settled steadily behind her eyes. "You look happy, Alina, truly happy." "I confess, given everything you told me at the start of this, I was not certain I would ever see that expression on your face." "I was not certain either," Alina admitted, laughing softly as she guided Grace through the halls toward the garden, where Alistair sat reading in the mild spring sunshine, considerably stronger now than the pale, exhausted man Alina had first encountered on her doorstep months earlier. "But I am Grace, happier than I ever expected to be, given how strangely all of this began." Grace watched Alistair rise carefully to greet her, noting the genuine warmth in his expression as he welcomed Alina's closest friend properly into their home for the first time. "I owe you an apology," Grace said honestly, once introductions had been exchanged. "I doubted this entire arrangement rather severely when Alina first told me. I am glad truly to have been wrong." "You had every reason for caution," Alistair said graciously. "I would have doubted it myself in your position. I am simply grateful Alina did not share quite so much caution when it mattered most." The afternoon passed pleasantly, filled with easy conversation and laughter that felt, to Alina, like the final piece settling comfortably into place within the new life she had built. As the sun began lowering toward evening, Grace prepared to leave, pulling Alina aside for a private moment before departing. "I am proud of you," Grace said softly, "for taking the leap even when it terrified you completely. Not everyone finds courage like that when it truly matters." Alina hugged her friend tightly, gratitude swelling warmly in her chest. "Thank you for standing beside me anyway, even when you were frightened for me. That mattered more than you probably realize." As spring deepened into early summer, Alistair's health continued its steady, cautious improvement. Dr. Whitfield's visits grew less frequent, his tone increasingly confident with each successive examination, until finally, during a checkup in late May, he delivered news that left both Alina and Alistair sitting in stunned, grateful silence. "Your heart function has stabilized remarkably well," the doctor explained, reviewing the latest test results with genuine wonder evident in his voice. "I am prepared to say, with far more confidence than I ever anticipated feeling, that your prognosis has shifted considerably. This is not a cure, and ongoing monitoring will remain necessary indefinitely. But Alistair, I believe we are looking at a genuinely long-term future now, rather than the timeline we once feared." Alistair sat quietly absorbing the news, emotion overwhelming his usually composed features entirely. Alina reached for his hand, squeezing tightly, both of them allowing themselves, finally and completely, to believe in the future stretching open before them. "Years," Alistair said softly, testing the word as though it still felt unfamiliar on his tongue. "Alina, we might actually have years." "We might," Alina agreed, tears of pure joy slipping freely down her cheeks now. "And I intend to spend every single one of them grateful for exactly how we found each other." Outside the window, the estate's gardens bloomed fully into early summer color. And inside, two people who had built something extraordinary out of desperate circumstances sat together, hand in hand, finally allowing themselves to imagine a future neither had dared hope for when this entire journey first began. Summer arrived warm and golden over Wintersea Hall, and with it came the final weeks of Alina's pregnancy, each day carrying a mixture of anticipation and quiet nervousness that neither she nor Alistair fully admitted aloud, though both felt it steadily building beneath the surface of their daily routines. Alistair's health continued its remarkable, steady improvement, enough that Dr. Whitfield had begun discussing, with genuine optimism, the possibility of reducing the frequency of his treatments in the coming months, provided his progress continued along its current trajectory. The household had settled into a warm, comfortable rhythm by late June, the earlier tension of Marcus's legal challenge fading gradually into memory, replaced instead by the practical preparations of impending parenthood. The nursery stood fully ready, the old family cradle polished and waiting, small clothes folded neatly in drawers that Margaret had overseen with the same devoted attention she brought to every aspect of caring for the family she had come to love as her own. "I never imagined I would feel this way about a house," Elena admitted one warm evening, sitting beside Alistair on a bench overlooking the rose garden, one hand resting on the considerable weight of her stomach. "When I first arrived here, it felt so large and cold. Now it feels like home in a way I do not think I have felt since before my mother passed." Alistair wrapped his arm gently around her shoulders, pulling her close despite the summer warmth. "I feel the same," he admitted. "I spent 30 years in these walls feeling like a guest in my own life. You changed that, Elena, completely." Their quiet evening was interrupted by a sudden, sharp intake of breath from Elena, her hand tightening instinctively against her stomach. "Alistair," she said, voice carrying a mixture of surprise and dawning realization, "I believe that might have been a contraction." What followed was a night neither of them would ever forget in its entirety, though pieces of it would remain forever etched sharply in memory. The hurried journey to the private maternity wing Dr. Whitfield had arranged months in advance, the long hours of labor during which Alistair remained steadily by Elena's side, despite his own doctor's gentle suggestions that he consider resting given his own medical history. And finally, in the early hours of the morning, the sound that changed everything entirely. The first strong cry of new life entering the world. "A daughter," Dr. Whitfield announced, exhaustion and genuine joy both evident in his voice as he carefully placed the small, wailing bundle into Elena's waiting arms. Healthy, strong lungs, and by the sound of things, already quite determined to make her presence known. Elena stared down at her daughter, overwhelming love flooding through her so completely that words entirely failed her for several long moments. Alistair leaned close beside her, tears streaming freely and unashamedly down his face, as he studied the small, perfect features of the child he had once feared he might never live to meet. "She is beautiful," he finally managed, voice rough with emotion. "Elena, she is absolutely beautiful." "What shall we name her?" Elena asked softly, gently offering the tiny bundle into Alistair's careful, trembling arms. Alistair studied his daughter's face for a long moment, something profound and settled crossing his own features as he considered the question seriously. "Cordelia," he said finally, "after my great-great-grandmother, whose portrait you admired the very first day you arrived at Wintersea Hall. The woman who married for duty and found love regardless, much the same as we did." Elena smiled through happy tears, watching Alistair cradle their daughter with a tenderness that erased, entirely, every trace of the cold, dutiful man he might have become had circumstances unfolded differently. "Cordelia," she agreed softly. "It is perfect." News of the birth spread quickly through the estate, met with genuine celebration among the household staff and tenant families alike. Margaret arrived at the hospital the following morning with flowers and happy tears of her own, insisting on holding the newest addition to the Wintersea family with the practiced ease of a woman who had clearly been waiting eagerly for this moment for months. "She has your eyes, Your Grace," Margaret observed, studying baby Cordelia's small features carefully as she cradled her gently. "And I dare say, given the strength of her cry last night, she has already inherited her mother's determination as well." Elena laughed softly from her hospital bed, exhaustion evident but happiness radiating from every part of her expression. "I hope she inherits Alistair's patience as well, to balance it out." "I believe," Alistair said, settling carefully onto the edge of the bed beside her, "our daughter is going to be considerably more stubborn than either of us combined, if this first night is any accurate indication." They returned to Wintersea Hall 3 days later, Cordelia sleeping peacefully in the very cradle that had once cushioned generations of Wintersea children before her. Alina stood in the doorway of the nursery that evening, watching Alastair gently rock the cradle, humming softly a tune she did not recognize, but suspected he was making up entirely on the spot, and felt a wave of gratitude so profound it nearly stole the breath from her chest. "What are you thinking?" Alastair asked softly, noticing her watching him. "I am thinking," Alina said, crossing the room to stand beside him, "that a year ago I was a hospital records clerk living alone in a small flat, with no idea that any of this was waiting for me. And now, here I am, standing in a nursery with my husband and our daughter, in a life I could not possibly have imagined for myself, no matter how hard I tried." Alastair wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close as they both looked down at their sleeping daughter. "I think often," he admitted quietly, "about how differently everything might have unfolded if you had simply closed that door on me the day I showed up on your doorstep with my absurd proposal. I am endlessly grateful you did not." "So am I," Alina said softly, resting her head against his shoulder. "Though I confess, some small part of me still cannot quite believe it all worked out this way, that the answer I gave you that morning on the phone somehow led us here, to this exact moment." "You gave me more than an answer that morning," Alastair said quietly, turning to look at her with an intensity that made her breath catch, even after everything they had already survived together. "You gave me a reason to fight for a future I had already surrendered entirely. I do not know if I would have pursued that experimental treatment at all, Alina, if you had not been standing beside me, refusing to let me give up so easily. You saved my life, in ways far beyond simply securing an heir for this estate." Alina felt tears gathering warmly in her eyes, overwhelmed by the depth of everything they had built together from such an improbable, desperate beginning. "You gave me a life I never expected to have," she said softly. "A family, a purpose, a love I did not know I was capable of feeling this completely, for someone I barely knew when this all began." They stood together in comfortable, grateful silence for a long while, watching their daughter sleep peacefully in the fading evening light, the weight of everything they had survived together finally settling into something steady, secure, and entirely their own. Months passed, summer softening gradually into autumn once more, marking a full year since the strange, desperate proposal that had first brought Alastair to Alina's doorstep. Alastair's health continued its remarkable stability, Dr. Whitfield eventually reducing his treatments to routine maintenance visits rather than the intensive schedule of that first difficult winter. Cordelia grew steadily, her personality emerging with exactly the determined stubbornness her parents had jokingly predicted on her very first night, filling the once quiet halls of Wintersea Hall with laughter and small, delighted shrieks that echoed pleasantly through rooms that had stood silent and formal for generations. Marcus, true to the court's ruling, remained entirely absent from their lives, though word occasionally reached them through distant family connections that he had relocated abroad, attempting, it seemed, to build some quieter life removed entirely from the ambitions that had nearly destroyed him. Alastair felt no particular satisfaction in his cousin's diminished circumstances, only a distant, complicated pity for a man who had allowed fear and resentment to cost him so completely. On the first anniversary of their wedding, Alastair and Alina held a small celebration at Wintersea Hall, considerably warmer and more joyful than the quiet, uncertain ceremony that had first bound them together. Grace attended, along with Henry and several other tenant families who had grown genuinely fond of their Duchess over the past year, along with the full household staff, who by now considered themselves less servants and more extended family to the couple they had watched fall so completely and unexpectedly in love. Standing together in the great hall, beneath the same portraits of ancestors who had watched their wedding vows exchanged 1 year earlier, Alastair raised a glass toward the small gathered crowd, Alina standing beside him with Cordelia settled comfortably on her hip. "A year ago," he began, his voice steady and warm, carrying none of the careful formality that had once defined every public word he spoke, "I stood in this very hall, having just married a woman I barely knew, driven entirely by desperation and duty. I expected, if I am honest, very little beyond a practical arrangement, a means of securing my family's legacy before an ending I believed was already close at hand. He turned to look at Alina, love evident in every line of his expression. Instead, I found something I never expected to find again in my life. I found a partner who refused to let me surrender, even when surrender felt like the easiest path forward. I found a reason to fight for a future I had already given up on entirely. And most importantly, I found love, real and complete, in the last place I ever expected to look for it. Alina felt tears gathering as he spoke, gratitude and love overwhelming her completely, as she watched him address their gathered friends and family with an openness that would have seemed impossible to the guarded, careful man she had first met on her doorstep, over a year ago now. To Alina, Alistair finished, raising his glass higher, who gave me far more than an heir to secure this estate. She gave me a reason to survive, and in doing so, gave me back my entire life. The small crowd raised their glasses in warm celebration, and Alina crossed the short distance between them, pressing a gentle kiss to Alistair's lips as Cordelia gurgled happily between them, entirely unaware of just how remarkable and improbable the story of her parents' love truly was. Later that evening, once their guests had departed and Cordelia had been settled peacefully to sleep, Alina and Alistair sat together in the study where this entire journey had first begun, the fire crackling low and warm in the grate exactly as it had that very first evening, months and months ago, when a frightened, dying stranger had asked an impossible question of a woman he barely knew. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Alina asked softly, resting comfortably against his shoulder. "When you showed up at my door with your absurd proposal?" "Constantly," Alistair admitted, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "I think about how terrified I was, certain you would simply close the door and leave me facing my remaining months entirely alone. I think about how completely my life changed, the moment you told me you had conditions rather than simply refusing outright." "I think about it too," Alina said softly. "About how strange it felt, agreeing to marry a stranger out of nothing more than instinct and a small kindness I barely remembered showing you. I did not know, that morning, that I was agreeing to the greatest adventure of my entire life." Alistair turned to look at her, warmth and gratitude and deep, settled love evident in every line of his healthy, contented face. "6 months," he said quietly, echoing the words that had once defined an ending, now transformed entirely into the beginning of everything that truly mattered. "That is what I thought I had left the day I walked into your life, and instead, Alina, you gave me forever." Alina smiled, leaning up to press one more gentle kiss to his lips, the fire crackling warmly beside them, their daughter sleeping peacefully upstairs, and an entire uncertain, hopeful future stretching open before them both, finally, completely, and entirely their own. Outside, autumn leaves drifted gently across the grounds of Wintersea Hall, marking the passage of a year that had transformed two strangers bound by desperate necessity into a family built on genuine, unshakable love proof, if either of them had still needed it, that sometimes the answer to an impossible question becomes not merely a solution, but an entire reason to keep living, fully and completely, for whatever years still remained ahead. Before the anniversary celebration, in early September, Wintersea Hall had hosted another significant occasion, Cordelia's christening, held in the same small stone chapel where Alistair and Alina had exchanged their own vows a year before. The chapel, once quiet and sparsely attended for their hurried wedding, now overflowed with genuine warmth and celebration, filled with tenant families, household staff, and friends who had watched this improbable love story unfold with growing affection over the preceding months. Grace stood as godmother, her earlier doubts about the entire arrangement long since replaced by unwavering devotion to both Alina and the small, determined child, now sleeping peacefully in her arms during the ceremony. Dr. Whitfield attended as well, watching the proceedings with quiet satisfaction, having played no small part in ensuring Alistair remained alive and healthy enough to witness this milestone in his daughter's life. "I did not think this time last year that I would be standing here today," Dr. Whitfield admitted to Alina during the small reception that followed, watching Alistair carry Cordelia carefully among the gathered guests, pride evident in every line of his healthy, contented posture. Medicine can only do so much in the end. I believe you gave him something equally important to whatever treatment we provided, a reason strong enough to fight for. Elena watched her husband and daughter moving through the crowd together, warmth flooding through her chest at the sight. I think we gave each other that, she said softly. In equal measure. The following weeks settled into the comfortable rhythm of new parenthood, Alistair and Elena learning together the small, exhausting joys of caring for an infant, sleepless nights, that somehow felt less burdensome shared between them. Small, triumphant milestones celebrated together, with a delight that surprised them both in its intensity. Alistair, despite his considerable wealth and access to household help, insisted on personally learning every aspect of caring for his daughter, refusing to simply delegate the experience to nursery staff the way his own father had done with him. I want to know her, he explained to Elena one exhausted but happy evening, having just successfully settled a fussy Cordelia to sleep himself. Not simply love her from a comfortable distance, the way I was raised. I want to actually know every part of who she becomes. Elena watched him with quiet, overwhelming affection, recognizing in his determination the healing of old wounds neither of them spoke of often, but both understood completely. You are already such a wonderful father, she said softly. Nothing like the distant man you feared you might become. I owe that entirely to you, Alistair said, pulling her close. You taught me that closeness was not weakness, Elena. That letting people in, rather than guarding myself against them, was its own kind of strength. I do not know who I would have become, facing my illness alone without you showing me that. As autumn deepened further into the golden final weeks before winter's return, Elena received one final piece of unexpected news that closed, quietly and completely, a chapter of her life she had long since made peace with leaving behind. A brief letter arrived from a solicitor, informing her that her father, Gerald, had passed away several months earlier, his modest remaining possessions left, somewhat surprisingly, entirely to her. She read the letter carefully, waiting for grief or anger or some complicated tangle of both to surface, but found instead only a quiet, settled sadness for the relationship they had never managed to build, followed by a gentle acceptance that some stories simply ended without resolution, and that this, too, was allowed. Are you all right? Alistair asked gently, watching her fold the letter carefully closed. I think so, Elena said honestly. I am sad for what we never had, but I do not think I need him any more, Alistair, to feel complete. I have everything I need right here in this house with you and Cordelia. Alistair pulled her gently into his arms, understanding completely the complicated weight she carried, offering comfort without needing further explanation. You built this family entirely on your own terms, he said softly. Whatever your father failed to give you, Elena, you have more than made up for it in everything you have built here instead. Elena rested against him, grateful beyond words for a partner who understood her so completely, who had walked beside her through every difficult chapter of the past year, without once asking her to be anything other than exactly who she was. That evening, as the anniversary celebration finally wound to its quiet close, and their guests departed into the cool autumn night, Alistair and Elena stood together at the tall windows of the great hall, watching the last of their friends' cars disappear down the long drive toward the main road. Cordelia slept soundly upstairs. The household had settled into peaceful quiet, and the two of them remained simply standing together, hand in hand, watching darkness settle gently over the grounds of the home they had built into something entirely their own. Whatever comes next, Alistair said quietly, I am ready for it now in a way I never expected to feel again. So am I, Elena agreed, resting her head against his shoulder as the first stars began appearing faintly overhead. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Exactly as we promised, that very first difficult year. And as the autumn night deepened peacefully over Wintersea Hall, two people who had built an entire lifetime of love out of a desperate, impossible beginning stood quietly together, grateful beyond measure for the improbable answer that had, against every reasonable expectation, given one dying man an entire reason to live. 5 years passed at Wintersea Hall, and the estate that had once stood silent and formal for generations now rang constantly with the sound of laughter, small footsteps racing across polished floors, and the easy warmth of a family that had built itself entirely out of love rather than mere obligation. Cordelia, now a bright, determined 5-year-old with her father's serious eyes and her mother's quick, easy laughter, had recently been joined by a younger brother, Theodore, born 2 years earlier during a pregnancy that Alina and Alastair had approached with considerably more confidence than their first, though no less joy. Alastair's health had remained remarkably stable throughout those 5 years, his experimental treatment eventually becoming a standard part of his routine care, monitored carefully, but no longer carrying the desperate uncertainty that had once defined every appointment with Dr. Whitfield. He had grown stronger with each passing year, enough that he now walked the estate's grounds daily without difficulty, often with Cordelia running eagerly ahead of him toward the tenant cottages she had grown to love, visiting nearly as much as her mother once had. "Henry says I can help feed the chickens today," Cordelia announced one bright spring morning, tugging insistently at her father's hand as they made their way down the familiar path toward the cottages. "He says I am getting very good at it." "I am certain you are," Alastair said, smiling down at his daughter with the easy warmth that had become entirely natural to him now. A far cry from the guarded, distant man he might have remained had circumstances unfolded differently 5 years earlier. "Henry does not compliment easily, so that is high praise indeed." Alina watched them from the garden, Theodore balanced comfortably on her hip, warmth flooding through her chest at the sight of her husband and daughter disappearing down the path together. Exactly as natural and easy as if he had been born into fatherhood, rather than having fought so desperately hard to survive long enough to experience it. The household had grown and changed alongside the family it served. Margaret, now considerably grayer but no less devoted, had taken on something resembling the role of beloved grandmother to both children, spoiling them with treats and stories in equal measure. Grace visited regularly, her own life having taken a happy turn as well, having married a kind schoolteacher she had met 2 years earlier, their own small daughter often accompanying her on visits to play alongside Cordelia in the estate's gardens. Marcus remained entirely absent from their lives, though occasional news filtered back through distant relatives, reports of a quieter, more modest existence built somewhere abroad, seemingly free of the ambition that had once driven him toward such desperate measures. Alastair thought of him rarely now, the old bitterness having faded gradually into something closer to distant, complicated indifference. Whatever Marcus had once threatened to take from them, he had failed entirely, and the family that remained had grown stronger and more complete precisely because of what they had survived together. On a warm evening in early June, 5 years to the day since that first desperate proposal on Alina's doorstep, the family gathered together in the garden for a simple, quiet dinner beneath the old oak tree that had stood on the grounds for centuries before any of them had been born. Cordelia chased fireflies with delighted shrieks while Theodore napped peacefully in Alina's arms, and Alastair watched it all with a contentment so complete it sometimes still startled him, even after all these years of steady, grateful living. "Do you remember?" Alina said softly, settling beside him as the evening light softened gold and warm across the garden. "How frightened you were, that very first day, certain I would simply close the door on you." "Vividly," Alastair admitted, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as Theodore stirred gently in her arms. "I have never been more terrified in my entire life, standing on your doorstep, certain I was about to be turned away and left facing everything alone." "And instead," Alina said, watching Cordelia's small figure dart happily through the garden, laughter carrying warmly on the evening air, "here we are." "Here we are," Alastair agreed, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. 5 years, 2 remarkable children, and a life I never once believed I would be fortunate enough to live, when I first received that diagnosis. I think of that frightened man in the doctor's office sometimes, and I hardly recognize him anymore. He believed his story was already ending. He had no idea it was only just beginning. Alina smiled, leaning into him comfortably, the weight of everything they had built together settling warm and secure around them both. I think about that morning too, she admitted. Sitting by my window with your card in my hand, trying to decide if I was brave enough to call. I am so grateful, Alistair, that I found the courage to dial that number. As am I, Alistair said softly, watching his daughter's small figure catch a firefly triumphantly between cupped hands, holding it up proudly for her parents to admire before releasing it gently back into the warm evening air. More grateful than I could ever properly express, for every single day since. As the sun finally set fully behind the old stone walls of Wintersea Hall, casting the estate into soft, peaceful twilight, the family gathered their things and made their way slowly back toward the house, Cordelia chattering excitedly about fireflies and chickens, and all the small, wonderful details of her happy, secure childhood, Theodore stirring awake in his mother's arms, reaching curiously toward the first stars beginning to appear overhead. Inside, the great hall welcomed them with warm lamplight, the portraits of ancestors watching from their gilded frames as they had for centuries, witnesses now to a family story considerably happier than many that had come before it within these walls. Alistair paused before the portrait of Lady Cordelia, the great-great-grandmother his daughter had been named for, studying the painted woman's careful expression with fresh understanding after all these years. I used to wonder if her story was truly as happy as family history claimed, he said quietly, Alina coming to stand beside him, Theodore now settled sleepily against her shoulder. I understand now why families choose to remember the happy endings, even from arrangements that began as difficult and uncertain as ours did. Because sometimes, against every reasonable expectation, that is exactly what they become. Alina reached for his hand, squeezing gently, their daughter's laughter still echoing pleasantly somewhere down the hallway as Margaret settled her in for the evening. I think our story will be remembered fondly too, she said softly, by whoever comes after us, standing in this same hall, looking up at our portrait someday, wondering about the strange, desperate beginning that somehow became the truest happiness either of us ever found. Alistair turned to look at her, love and gratitude and quiet, settled peace evident in every line of his healthy, contented face. 5 years removed now from the frightened, dying man who had once knocked desperately on a stranger's door with nothing left to lose. I love you, he said simply, the words carrying all the weight and warmth of everything they had built together. More completely than I ever believed myself capable of, when this all began. I love you too, Alina said softly, resting her head against his shoulder as they stood together in the quiet, lamplit hall, their children safe and happy nearby. The estate that had once felt so cold and empty now filled entirely with warmth, laughter, and the kind of love that neither of them had dared hope for on that strange and desperate morning 5 years before, when an impossible question had somehow found its way to exactly the right answer. Outside, the last light of evening faded gently over the grounds of Wintersea Hall, and inside, a family built from courage, honesty, and an answer that had once given a dying man a reason to survive settled peacefully into another ordinary, extraordinary evening together, grateful, every single day, for the improbable story that had brought them here, and for every single year still waiting patiently ahead. Years later, when Cordelia was old enough to ask properly about how her parents had met, Alina would tell her the story slowly, honestly, leaving out none of the fear or uncertainty that had shaped those early, difficult months. She told her about the frightened man who had knocked on a stranger's door with an impossible request, about the courage it had taken to say yes to something that made no sense on paper, and about the slow, steady way that necessity had transformed gradually into something real and lasting. "Were you not scared?" Cordelia asked one evening, curled beside her mother on the study sofa, the same fire crackling warmly in the grate that had witnessed so many quiet, important conversations over the years. "Terrified," Alina admitted honestly. But sometimes, my darling, the things worth having require us to be brave anyway, even when we are frightened. Your father needed someone willing to be brave alongside him. I am endlessly grateful I found the courage to be that person. Cordelia considered this seriously, the way children often did when absorbing lessons far larger than they could yet fully understand. I am glad you were brave, she said finally. Otherwise, I would not be here. Elena laughed softly, pulling her daughter close. Neither would any of this, she agreed, gesturing gently toward the warm, lived-in study around them, toward the sound of Theodore's laughter drifting faintly from another room, toward the entire life they had built together from nothing more than one honest answer, given by a frightened woman to a dying man, on an ordinary morning that had turned out to be anything but ordinary at all. Alistair appeared in the doorway then, drawn by the sound of their conversation, watching his wife and daughter together with the same quiet wonder that had never entirely faded, even after all these years of steady, grateful living. He crossed the room and settled beside them both, Cordelia immediately shifting to make room for him, and for a long moment the three of them simply sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn warm and steady in the grate. "Tell me the story again," Cordelia said eventually, looking between her parents with bright, curious eyes. "The whole thing, from the very beginning." Alistair and Elena exchanged a warm, knowing glance, the same story they had told countless times before, though it never once grew tiresome in the telling, precisely because every retelling reminded them both, freshly and completely, exactly how remarkable their improbable journey together had truly been. "It began," Alistair said softly, settling back comfortably into the worn cushions of the study sofa, his daughter leaning eagerly against his side, "with 6 months, and a question I never expected anyone brave enough to answer." And as the fire crackled warmly against the gathering evening outside, the story continued, told once more in the quiet comfort of a home built entirely from courage, honesty, and a love that had, against every reasonable expectation, given one dying man an entire lifetime worth living.